They say the Iron Wolf never kneels. 15 years on the Obsidian throne. 15 years of crushed rebellions, shattered coalitions, and enemies who learned it was too late, that defiance is just another word for a slow death. But tonight, in the flickering candlelight of a dying house at the edge of the Empire, a 19-year-old girl reads a royal decree and understands something the generals never could. The most powerful man in the world isn't asking, he's collecting. Stay until the very end, because this story will break every rule you think you know about power, sacrifice, and what it costs to survive when survival demands everything. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The decree arrived on a Tuesday. Not that the day mattered much in Everwyn anymore. Days had a way of bleeding together when there was not enough bread to count them by. When the livestock pen stood empty and the well water tasted of rust, and something else that nobody said out loud, but everyone recognized. Despair had its own flavor. Elira Everwyn had been drinking it for 3 years. She was standing in the great hall when the Imperial messenger rode through the gates. She knew what he was before he dismounted. The black and silver livery, the wax seal heavy enough to sink in deep water. The way his horse had been ridden hard, foam at the bit, as though the message it carried burned through the saddlebag. She took the letter herself. She did not let Aldrich, her house steward, intercept it, though she saw his fingers twitch toward the habit of it. Old Aldrich had spent 30 years softening blows before they reached her father. Her father was 3 months in the ground, and Elira had not yet figured out how to break the man of his instinct to protect a lord who no longer existed. The messenger was young, younger than she expected from the imperial post. He had dust ground into the creases of his neck, and he smelled like horse sweat and road, and his eyes would not settle anywhere near her face. That told her more than the letter did. "Refreshments for our guest?" she said over her shoulder, to no one in particular, because there were always servants hovering at the threshold of that hall, anxious and quiet, hoping to read the shape of the news from her posture before she spoke it aloud. "And water for his horse." She broke the seal in the corner of the room, near the window where the afternoon light came in gray and thin. The parchment was heavy stock, imperial grade, the kind that cost more per sheet than her house's daily grain ration. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it flat against her palm, and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of absolute stillness. 10 seconds where her face could do whatever it needed to do without anyone watching, where her lungs could tighten and her jaw could lock, and her hands could shake with something that was not quite fear, but shared all of fear's physical symptoms. Then she tucked the letter into her sleeve and turned back to the hall with the same expression she had worn walking in. Her mother had called it the Everwyn face, the face that gives nothing away. They had been practicing it for generations, the women of this house. It was not strength, her mother always said. It was something older and more practical than strength. It was the understanding that the world reads a woman's face the way wolves read weakness in a herd, and you do not give it the satisfaction. "Aldrich," she said. "My lady." "Call the household council, 1 hour." She paused at the threshold. "And somebody find my brother. He's in the stables probably. Tell him to wash his hands before he comes in." She climbed the stairs alone. She allowed herself to read the letter one more time in the privacy of her chamber, standing by the window that overlooked the eastern fields, the ones that had gone brown this season, the ones that were supposed to feed 200 families through winter and now would feed perhaps 60, the ones the crown had assessed and found wanting and had given House Everwyn 14 weeks to either resurrect or surrender. The letter was brief. Imperial letters always were. Power did not require elaborate justification. By order of His Imperial Majesty Vialor Draven, King of Valor, Lord Sovereign of the 12 provinces, Keeper of the Western Passes and Protector of the Eastern Coasts, the matter of House Everwyn's outstanding territorial debt, as reviewed by the Imperial Assessment Bureau in the 3rd month of the year of the Iron Banner, is herein addressed as follows. His Majesty extends an offer of debt forgiveness, territorial restoration, and emergency grain provision to the people of Everwyn, contingent upon one condition. The eldest daughter of the late Lord Caston Everwyn, one Lady Elira Everwyn, aged 19, is invited to present herself at Blackspire Palace no later than the 21st day of the current month, to discuss the terms of a proposed political union with the Crown. House Everwyn's cooperation will be noted and rewarded. House Everwyn's refusal will be noted as well. She set the letter down on the windowsill and watched the brown fields for a long time. Political union. That was the language they used when they meant marriage. And marriage to the crown meant one thing when there was only one person who wore it. Valor Draven, the Iron Wolf, the man who had killed his own father on the steps of the obsidian throne and spent the next 15 years making sure every corner of the empire remembered why. She was 19 years old and she had never been to the capital. She thought about her people. She thought about the 60 families instead of 200. She thought about the children she had seen last week at the mill, ribs showing through their shirts, and the way their mothers had looked at her with that specific combination of hope and apology that the desperate use when they are ashamed of their own need. She thought about her brother Kyle, 17 years old, who still believed the world was fundamentally fair if you were brave enough and worked hard enough, who had not yet learned the lesson that Elira had been learning in grinding daily installments since her father's illness began. That the world is not fair. That fairness is a story the comfortable tell themselves so they can sleep. That survival does not care about your values. It only cares whether you're still standing. She picked up the letter again. His Majesty's refusal will be noted as well. There it was. No ambiguity, no diplomatic softening. The Iron Wolf did not bother with elegant threats. He simply told you exactly how much it would cost to say no, and then let you do the arithmetic. She had 14 days to reach the capital. She spent the remaining hour before the council meeting sitting on the edge of her bed, not crying, because there was nothing useful in crying, and she had run out of useful things to waste, pressing her palms flat against her thighs and breathing slowly through her nose the way her mother had taught her. "You are an Everwin," her mother used to say, which was not a comfort so much as a set of instructions. An orientation. A reminder that the name came with obligations that predated your own feelings about them. She was an Everwin. She had 14 days. She got up and went to the council meeting and told them what the letter said. The council was 4 people, which was all the council house Everwin could still afford. Aldrich, who had been steward since before Elira was born, and whose loyalty was so complete and so quiet that it sometimes felt like grief. Marin, the house's head physician, a compact woman in her 50s who spoke rarely and precisely and had kept Elira's father alive for 8 months beyond any reasonable expectation. Torvas, the master of arms, who was 53 and walked with a limp from an old campaign, and who had the particular bone-deep exhaustion of a soldier who had survived every war he'd been sent to and suspected the ones ahead would finally collect their debt. And her brother Kyle. Kyle was the one who reacted first. "No," he said. Just that. Flat and immediate, the word landing like a fist on the table. Elira looked at him steadily. He had their father's coloring, dark-haired and sharp-jawed, and right now his face was doing the thing it did when he was frightened and trying to cover it with anger, which was a Kale-specific habit she had been watching her whole life. He was not as practiced at the Everwin face as she was. "No," he said again, as though repetition would reinforce the architecture of it. "He can't. You're not. This isn't. You can't just be summoned like property." "I'm not being summoned," she said. "I'm being offered a choice." "That's not a choice. That's a cage with better lighting." "Perhaps," she kept her voice even. "But our people are starving, Kale, and the alternative to this particular cage is watching Everwin territories get absorbed by the crown within the month, which means our people become crown tenants under a governor who has no reason to be generous with them. There are other options. Name one." He was silent. "Name one," she said again, not unkindly. "I've been trying to find one for 3 months. Every favor father had, I've called in. Every alliance we were owed, I've petitioned. The surrounding houses are managing their own disasters. The banking houses won't extend further credit without security we don't have. The harvest failed. We have 1 functioning mill. We have 43 armed men. Name a single option I haven't exhausted." Kyle looked at the table. His hands, she noticed, were clean. He had washed them, as asked. That detail, for some reason, made her chest hurt more than anything else in the room. "There must be something," he said very quietly, all the fight suddenly gone out of it. "There is," she said. "There's this." Aldrich cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had been calculating since the moment she had spoken and had now finished. "The terms, my lady. Did the letter specify terms beyond the union itself? Debt forgiveness, territorial restoration, emergency grain provision. She laid the letter on the table. Complete. Immediate. No conditions beyond my presenting myself at the palace. Marin leaned forward and read the letter without picking it up. Her face was entirely unreadable, which was a professional quality Elira had always respected in her. It's a strong offer, Marin said finally. It's a purchase, Cale said. Yes, Elira agreed. It is. Most political marriages are. She looked at her brother until he met her eyes. The question is whether the price is worth what we get for it. The room was quiet for a long time. Torvas, who had not spoken yet, turned the bottom of his cup slowly against the table. He did this when he was thinking through something with multiple variables. She had learned to wait.
He's not a kind man, Torvas said. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I served in the Vanthari campaigns under the imperial standard. I saw the king in the field. He doesn't operate the way other commanders operate. There's no warmth in it. He's effective, and he's cold, and he believes in results above everything else. He paused. But I've never heard of him being deliberately cruel to civilians, or to women. That's not nothing.
That's a very low standard, Cale said. It's the standard available, Torvas replied, with the patience of a man who had stopped expecting better standards some years ago. Elira had already made her decision. She had made it, if she was honest, the moment she folded the letter in the great hall and felt the architecture of the choice settle into her bones. She had not needed the council meeting to tell her what she already knew. She had needed it because the decision had weight that should not be carried alone, and because the people in this room had earned the right to hold part of it with her. I'll go, she said. Elira, I'll go, she said again, meeting Cale's eyes. And you will not argue with me about it, because there is nothing left to argue. I need you to run this house in my absence. I need you to manage the grain distribution when it arrives, and hold the eastern tenants together and not let Aldrich work himself into the ground, trying to do everything himself. She paused. I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Do you? The question was honest enough that it deserved an honest answer. No, she said, but I'm going anyway. She left for the capital 4 days later, traveling with a guard of 6 men because that was all the house could spare, in a carriage that had once been fine and now showed the particular dignity of age, a thing that had been well made enough that it still functioned despite everything. The roads from Everwyn to the capital were 3 days of hard travel in good weather. The weather was not good. By the second day, the rain had turned the eastern roads to mud-slick misery, and the carriage lurched and shuddered through every low stretch, with the complaint of old wood under new stress. Elira sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and watched the landscape change through the fogged window, the low hills of Everwyn giving way to larger country, thicker forests, broader roads that bore the traffic of the Empire's real commerce. She had packed carefully. 3 dresses suitable for court, all of them technically appropriate, and none of them impressive enough to suggest ambition, because she had thought about that specific signal. A small collection of books that she was probably not going to read. A knife in her boot, because her father had insisted she learn to carry one at 15, and old habits were better than no habits. A letter for Cale in the event that things went very wrong, which she had spent half a night writing and then folded very small and tucked into the spine of one of the books she was not going to read. She spent the second night of travel in a way-station inn that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. The innkeeper's wife brought her soup that was mostly broth and tried not to stare. Elira drank it and thanked her and slept 6 hours in a bed that was too soft in the middle and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed slowly and was still imperfect at, but was trying to maintain. The capital appeared on the morning of the 3rd day. She had heard it described. Everyone had heard Blackspire described. The way the towers caught the light, the way the roads widened as you approached it, as though the city itself was practicing for a theater of the world. The walls that had never been breached in recorded history, the spires of the palace visible from 12 miles out on a clear day. The descriptions were accurate. They were also insufficient. There was something about the scale of it that defied the preparation language offered. The walls were not merely tall, they were inevitable tall. The kind of height that stopped being architecture and started being a statement about what humans were capable of when enough of them were forced toward a single purpose for long enough. The city spread beyond those walls in concentric rings of commerce and life. Markets and workshops and inns and streets packed with the business of an empire at full capacity, the noise of it reaching the carriage as a kind of sustained roar that she felt more than heard. Black Spire Palace rose from the center of all of it. Black stone and crystal towers, banners in silver and black, the obsidian thrones colors, which were not colors so much as the absence of them. She could see it clearly even from this distance, the way it stood above everything else like a declaration that had been made in stone and never needed to be repeated. She pressed her thumb into the heel of her other hand and breathed. The gate guards wore the full imperial livery. They checked the carriage, verified her identity against a list that apparently anticipated her, and waved them through with the brisk efficiency of people who processed arrivals too regularly to find any of them interesting. Inside the outer walls, the noise became more structured, less roar, more layered conversation. The city's inner districts were expensive and self-aware, the buildings taller and the streets cleaner, the people dressed in the specific way of people who are near power and have calibrated every detail of their appearance to reflect that proximity. The palace itself. A chamberlain met her at the inner gate. He was a thin man of perhaps 60, impeccably dressed, who introduced himself as Senol, and who had the professional warmth of someone who had perfected the performance of welcome without ever letting anything actual reach the surface. "Lady Everwyn," he said, "we've prepared chambers in the East Wing. His Majesty will receive you this evening for a formal introduction. There will be time to refresh yourself and rest before then." "Thank you," she said. She followed him through corridors that made the great hall at Everwyn look like a shed. The floors were white marble with inlaid silver. The ceilings were vaulted and painted, scenes she did not have time to interpret properly as she walked beneath them. The chandeliers were exactly as described, crystal and candlelight, throwing a fractured glow across everything that turned ordinary movement into something that looked choreographed. It was all very deliberately overwhelming. She recognized the technique. When you cannot impress people with who you are, you impress them with where you stand. She was not entirely unimpressed. She was not going to let that show. Her chambers were in the East Wing, 3 rooms that were nicer than anything she had lived in 3 years. And she spent exactly 20 minutes appreciating the bath before she started thinking strategically again, because 20 minutes was what she could afford. She had been given information about the evening's formalities by Señol. A dinner. 6 members of the High Council would be present. The king would speak with her privately after the meal, which was not standard protocol, but which apparently the king had specified. She had been given nothing else. No guidance. No preparation. The implication was that she should not need guidance, which was itself a kind of test. She dressed carefully. The dark blue dress, not the nicest one she had brought, but the most precise, formal without being ornamental. It said, "I am here seriously." It said nothing else. She arrived in the dining hall 60 seconds before the appointed time, which was not early enough to seem anxious and not late enough to seem careless, and which she had calculated on the walk over. The High Council was already seated. 6 men, ranging from perhaps 45 to perhaps 70, all wearing the various decorations of their stations, all watching her enter with the specific quality of attention that people use when they are assessing something that has just entered their territory. She knew their names from what preparation she had been able to manage in 3 days. Lord Harwick, the Chancellor, eldest and most politically established. Lord Sane, the Treasury Minister, who had the lean, careful look of a man who counted everything. Admiral Croft, silver-haired and brick-shaped, who had rebuilt the Imperial Navy after the Vanthari Wars. Lord Renlar, the Senate liaison, who was 46 and ambitious and reportedly the most dangerous of the 6 for exactly that reason. Lord Morton, who managed the eastern provinces and who had reportedly supported the debt assessment that had brought her here in the first place. And Lord Cassil, the youngest, who was 41 and said to be closest to the king. They looked at her the way a committee looks at a proposal it expects to reject. She took her seat, accepted wine she was not going to drink, and waited. The king arrived 7 minutes after she sat. She had been told he was tall. She had not been told about the quality of his presence, which was distinct from his physical dimensions, and which she would have struggled to describe if asked. Only that when Valor Draven walked into a room, it did something to the air in it, a compression or a shift, as though the room itself made adjustments to accommodate him. He moved like someone who had never once in his life considered whether he had the right to occupy space. Not arrogance, exactly. Something older and more fundamental than arrogance. The absolute certainty of a person who had been the most dangerous thing in every room he had entered for so long that the awareness of it had become unconscious. He was 38, dark-haired, close-cropped. There was a scar along his jaw on the left side that she had heard about, but that she had expected to be more prominent. It was not. It was just a line, pale and old. His eyes were gray in this light. In some lights, she suspected they were closer to green. He sat at the head of the table with the settled authority of a man who had no need to perform his own power because it had never once occurred to him to question it. He looked at her immediately upon sitting. Not the evaluating look that the council had given her. Something more direct than that and less categorizable, like a man looking at a variable in an equation he has not yet solved. "Lady Everwyn," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. "Your Majesty," she said, "you made good time." The roads were passable. "They weren't," he said. "We had reports of flooding on the eastern stretch near Varen's Crossing. Your driver either knows better roads or was pushing hard." She had not known that was a test. She filed it. "Both," she said. Something in his expression changed very slightly, not enough to be called amusement, more like the small internal notation of a man who has added a data point to a calculation. Dinner proceeded. The council members spoke around and past her in the way that made clear they considered her presence decorative until proven otherwise. They discussed northern border tensions and grain reserve reports, and a pending treaty negotiation with the Elvric principalities as though she were a piece of furniture, occasionally glancing at her the way one checks furniture to confirm it has not moved. She ate steadily and listened to everything. The king spoke rarely during dinner. When he did, it was brief and conclusive. Twice she watched council members revise their positions mid-sentence in response to a single comment from him. Not because he raised his voice or applied obvious pressure, because the comments were always precisely accurate, and accuracy in a room full of managed information was its own form of dominance. After the meal, the council departed in the way of men who have been dismissed without technically being told to leave. A servant brought wine. Valor indicated the chair across from him with one finger. She sat. He studied her in the silence for long enough that someone with less practice at stillness would have spoken to fill it. She waited. "You're not what I expected," he said. What did you expect? Someone who would spend the meal trying to charm the council." He picked up his cup. "Or someone who would spend it looking frightened." "Would either approach have been useful?" "No." "Then why would I have done either?" He was quiet for a moment. The firelight from the far wall moved across his face, and she could see, more clearly now than at the table, what she had noticed from the first moment and not yet allowed herself to fully name. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a single poor night, but the deep mineral tiredness of a person who has been operating under sustained weight for so long that it had become structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of him. "You understand what's being proposed," he said. It was not a question. "A political marriage," she said. "Your hand in exchange for my house's survival. And presumably something else, or you would have issued a standard political summons to a noble family rather than a personal decree." He looked at her. "You read people." "I read letters," she said. "Yours was interesting." "How so?" "It didn't threaten. It didn't offer. It simply presented the arithmetic." She tilted her head slightly. "Most powerful men, in my experience, can't resist embellishment. They add language that makes the power visible. Your letter had none of that. The power was in the absence of decoration." Something shifted in his eyes. "The council won't accept you," he said. Not cruelly, just factually, in the way he seemed to deliver most things. "They'll view the marriage as a liability, a weakness, evidence that the king is allowing sentiment to compromise strategic decision-making." "And is he?" The question sat between them. "No," he said, after a pause that had calculation in it. "He is not." She kept her voice careful. "Then what is this?" "An alliance," he said. "Valor has enemies on 4 borders and a Senate that tests its own authority against mine every legislative session. I need a queen who can operate politically without requiring management. The houses that could provide that have been positioning themselves aggressively for a match for 3 years." Every candidate they've presented comes wrapped in the ambitions of her family. He set down his cup. Everwin is not in a position to have ambitions. The words were blunt enough to land. She let them. No, she said evenly. We're in a position to have groceries. His expression did not change, but something in the room did. A slight atmospheric shift. You're angry, he observed. I'm practical, she said. Being angry about the truth is something I've had to unlearn. It wastes energy that's more useful elsewhere. Where did you learn that? 3 years of watching my father's illness and my house's decline from the front row. She kept her eyes level with his. When things fall apart consistently, you either spend all your resources being angry about the falling, or you start figuring out how to catch what's still worth saving. Valor Draven looked at her for a long time. Then he said, quietly, Your people will have grain within the week. The debt is already forgiven. That was processed before you arrived. She absorbed that. Before I arrived, she said. The terms were not conditional on your acceptance. She stared at him. Then why? Because I was not going to hold 200 families hostage against a negotiation, he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite irritation, but was in the same family. I needed leverage to ensure you would come to the capital. I used it. That's not the same as intending to follow through on the harm. Elira was quiet for a long moment. Something was recalibrating inside her, slowly, like a compass adjusting to a changed field. That's a surprisingly important distinction, she said. Most important distinctions are the ones nobody announces. She studied him. He looked back at her without performing anything. There is something that they don't tell you about powerful people, the thing the stories leave out when they build them into legends. The stories give them menace, or they give them charisma, and sometimes both. But what they almost never give them is this quality that Valor Draven had sitting across from her in the firelight of his dining hall. He looked like a man who had been carrying something genuinely heavy for a very long time without putting it down, and who had reached the particular point that comes after endurance, which is not peace and is not exhaustion, but is something stranger, a state of permanent vigilance that has become indistinguishable from the person himself. She recognized it. She had been developing something like it herself. I'll need time to consider, she said. You have until morning. I'll need more than that. His eyes narrowed slightly. Lady Everwin. Your Majesty, she said back, steady as stone. You've told me the grain is already sent and the debt is already forgiven, which means I am no longer negotiating under duress. I am negotiating as a person with the basic minimum of stability restored. She held his gaze. Under those conditions, I will need 3 days. The silence stretched. 2, he said. 2, she agreed. Yes. She stood because it felt necessary to be the one to close the conversation, and offered a correct, unhurried curtsy and walked to the door and was almost through it when his voice came from behind her. Lady Everwin? She stopped, did not turn immediately. What made you come? He asked. Before you received confirmation that the terms were already processed, what was it that made you pack a bag and get in the carriage? She turned then. He was watching her from across the room, and the firelight was behind him now. And for a moment he looked less like a king and more like something that had been forged in a very specific kind of fire for a very long time, and had come out the other side of it permanently altered. The same thing that made you send the grain before the negotiation, she said. The understanding that some debts have to be paid before you know whether they'll be returned. She left. The corridor outside was quiet and cool, lit by the crystal chandeliers that threw light in fractured patterns across the white marble, and she walked through it with her hands at her sides and her breath controlled and her face doing nothing in particular. She did not let herself think too much about the evening until she reached her chamber, and even then she allowed only a brief review, the careful kind that cataloged information without drawing conclusions she didn't yet have enough data to support. He was not what she had expected. She had expected brutality. She had expected the obvious performance of power, the kind that needs witnesses. She had gotten something more complicated than that, and complication was always harder to navigate than simple brutality, because simple brutality at least tells you exactly where you stand. She was still thinking through the texture of the evening, still turning the conversation in careful increments, when she heard the sound. It came from the corridor she had just passed. Not a shout. Something quieter, and therefore worse, the sound of a confrontation that was being conducted below the volume that might summon witnesses. She should have kept walking. She turned back. Lord Renlar was in the alcove at the end of the corridor, the ambitious one, the Senate liaison, and he had a servant girl by the wrist, and the way he held it was not a question. "I just have one question for you," he said to the girl, and his voice was very pleasant, which was the worst thing about it. "Before you take that message where you're going, I want you to think very carefully about who employs you in this palace, and who it is that could have that employment ended before sunrise." The girl was perhaps 16. Her face was the face of someone doing the exact calculation Elira had done in the Great Hall 3 weeks ago. The arithmetic of survival versus dignity, all of it running fast and silent behind her eyes. Elira stepped into the alcove. "Lord Renlar," she said. He turned. His expression had time to do several things in very quick succession. Surprise. Recalibration. Then the slow smoothing over that men like him were very good at, the settling back into the social form. "Lady Everwyn," his voice was warm as a trap, "you should be resting. Difficult days ahead for you, I'd imagine. And you should release that girl's wrist," she said. "Because if you don't, I'm going to describe this alcove and its contents to the king in significantly greater detail than you'll find comfortable." The silence was its own thing. He released the girl's wrist. "You're new here," he said softly. "I'd counsel you to understand the politics of the palace before you start inserting yourself into matters that don't concern you." "The politics of the palace," she repeated. "Is that what this is?" "Everything in this palace is politics," he said, "including you." He walked away. His footsteps were unhurried. Elira watched him go, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not satisfaction and was not anger, but was the particular cold clarity she had learned to trust, the quality that arrived in her when things became genuinely serious and everything unnecessary burned off, leaving only the core of what was real. She turned to the girl. "Are you all right?" The girl was shaking, very slightly, in the way that happens when the body starts processing what the mind had to put aside in order to function during the threat. "He wanted to know if the message I was carrying was for you," the girl said. Her voice was barely there. "Was it?" "Yes, my lady." She offered a folded note. Elira took it, opened it. It was a single line in a hand she did not recognize. "Do not accept the proposal. You are not safe here. Meet me tomorrow at second bell, the East Courtyard Garden." She read it twice. Then she looked up at the girl. "Who gave you this?" "I was told to say it came from a friend of your house," the girl whispered. Elira folded the note again. Her hands were steady. She looked down the corridor where Lord Renlar had disappeared. She looked at the note. She thought about the king's face across the firelit table and the tiredness in it that was not performance. She thought about the grain already sent without conditions. She thought about 200 families. She thought about the world and its habit of presenting impossible arithmetic at moments of maximum inconvenience, and the way it never waited for you to be ready before it made the calculation due. In the silence of the corridor, under the fractured light of crystal chandeliers, Elira Everwyn looked at the note in her hand and understood that whatever she had walked into, it was already significantly more complicated than a political marriage. Somewhere in this palace, someone needed her afraid enough to refuse. Somewhere in this palace, someone else had sent grain to starving people before they were asked. And now she had 2 days to figure out which of those two facts was going to determine whether she survived the third. She did not sleep. That was the honest account of the night. She lay in the bed that was too soft in the middle and held the folded note against her sternum in the dark, and ran the evening through her mind in slow, careful increments the way you check a structure for cracks, not looking for drama, looking for truth. The note said, "You are not safe here." That was the phrase she kept returning to. Not "the king is dangerous," which would have been the obvious warning from an obvious direction. Not "leave while you can," which would have been fear speaking in the blunt way fear preferred. Someone had written, "You are not safe here," which was a precise distinction. It did not say the king was the threat. It said the palace was. Those were different things. She thought about Lord Renlar in the alcove, the pleasantness of his voice while he held a 16-year-old girl by the wrist, the way he had looked at Elira when she intervened, not angry exactly, but recalibrating, the way a strategist looks at a board that has just produced an unexpected move. He had wanted to know what was in that message before it reached her, which meant he already knew a message was coming, which meant he was watching her. On her first night, she pressed the note flat against her ribs and stared at the dark ceiling and thought, someone in this palace is afraid of what I might agree to, and someone else is afraid of what I might refuse. When the light through the window grayed toward morning, she rose, washed her face in cold water that made her catch her breath, and sat at the writing desk with a single candle and thought through what she knew with the same methodical care she had applied to the house accounts during the worst months of the decline. Facts only. No speculation dressed as fact. That was the rule. Fact, the king had forgiven the debt before the negotiation. That was not the behavior of a man who needed leverage once he had his goal in hand. That was the behavior of a man who used leverage to open a door, and then, once the door was open, put the weapon down. Fact. Lord Renlar had moved against her within 3 hours of her arrival. That kind of speed required pre-existing infrastructure. He had not improvised. He had activated something already prepared. Fact. Someone with access to the palace had sent her a warning using back channels rather than approaching her directly. That meant either they could not approach her directly, or they did not want to be seen doing so, which in a palace full of managed information amounted to the same thing. She folded the note very small and tucked it into the lining of her boot, which was where the knife was, because if you were going to hide things, you should keep them in the same place. Then she dressed, put the Everwin face on with the same deliberate attention she gave to everything else that mattered, and went to find breakfast. The east courtyard garden was a long, narrow space between the palace's inner and outer walls, planted formally in the imperial style. Symmetrical and controlled, hedges trimmed to precise geometric shapes, gravel paths that did not allow for soft footsteps. The kind of garden that was beautiful in the way that surveillance was beautiful, everything visible, nothing concealed. Second bell was 3 hours away. She spent the morning doing what she had been doing since she arrived, watching. A palace, she was discovering, was a specific kind of ecosystem. It had its own food chains, its own territorial markings, its own methods of communication that operated below the layer of formal language. You could read it if you paid attention to what moved in the corridors and what stayed still. Who deferred to whom, and whether the deference was fear or respect or calculation. Which servants moved with the particular alert efficiency of people who reported what they saw to someone above them in the chain. She had 2 observations solidify before second bell. The first was that Lord Casil, the youngest of the council, and reportedly the one closest to the king, moved through the palace in a way that was subtly different from the other council members. Less territorial, more watchful. He did not perform his power the way Renlar did, or wear it like armor the way Harwick did. He carried it quietly, which in Elira's experience meant either that he was genuinely secure in it, or that he had spent a long time learning to make it invisible for strategic reasons. The second was that there were 2 distinct categories of staff in this palace, those who worked in it and those who watched it. The watchers were not obvious, they had cover functions, but they moved with a slightly different rhythm than the people around them, a fraction more deliberate, the way a musician in a crowd moves differently from people who are just walking. Someone had built a significant intelligence infrastructure inside Blackspire. She was thinking about whether that was the king's infrastructure or someone else's when she arrived at the East Courtyard Garden at precisely second bell and found Lord Casil standing at the far end of the central path, looking at a hedge. She stopped. He turned. "Lady Everwin," he said. His voice was nothing like Renlar's had been. It was careful in a different way. The careful of someone choosing words because words mattered, not because performance required them. "Thank you for coming. You sent the note," she said. "Yes." "You knew Renlar would try to intercept it." "I expected he would try." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know he'd be quite so direct about it on your first night. That's information in itself." She studied him. He was 41, she remembered. Dark complexion, gray starting at his temples. He had the look of a man who had been through something and come out the other side of it with his essential character intact, which was a kind of resilience she recognized as genuinely hard to maintain. "Who are you to the king?" she said. Not a rhetorical question, a real one. "The closest thing he has to a friend," Casil said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not sentiment exactly, but was in its neighborhood. which is not a comfortable position to occupy and which I've spent 11 years arguing myself out of and failing. Why are you warning me? Because what's building in this palace is going to be very bad for anyone who doesn't see it coming. He moved to the stone bench at the center of the garden and sat, which was an invitation and also a statement that he intended to be thorough. Sit down. There's more than a few minutes worth. She sat. Malrek Voss, Casil said. She knew the name. Everyone in the Empire knew the name. Lord Malrek Voss, the Empire's wealthiest noble, governor of the 3 richest southern provinces. A man whose personal military forces were larger than the standing armies of some foreign kingdoms, and whose political influence in the Senate was substantial enough to have blocked 3 of the king's legislative initiatives in the past year. He's been building something for 4 years, Casil said. A coalition, not a public one, the kind that builds in the negative space of official record. Governors who've been feeling the pressure of the king's centralization policies. Military commanders who believe power has drifted too far from the traditional aristocracy. Foreign rulers who see Valor's strength as a ceiling on their own ambitions. He paused. And members of the High Council. Renlar, she said. Renlar is the most visible, he said. Not the only one. She breathed slowly. The garden was quiet around them. A bird somewhere in the formal hedge. Nothing else. Why is my marriage relevant to this? She said. Casil looked at her directly. Because Voss has been positioning a candidate for the Queen's seat for 2 years. Lady Saren Voss, his niece, 22 years old, politically connected, well-presented, and the kind of match that would give Voss formal access to the palace's inner sanctum. He paused. The king rejected her 3 times. Voss assumed it was timing. It was not timing. Another pause. The king doesn't want a queen who comes equipped with her house's intelligence network. He wants someone who doesn't have the infrastructure to run one. Someone from a house that's been hollowed out by disaster, she said. Yes. That's an extraordinarily cold piece of strategic thinking. He's an extraordinarily cold strategic thinker. Casil said it without judgment, the way you state a fact about weather. The question is whether the coldness is all there is. She waited. He looked at the hedge for a moment. I've known Valor for 15 years. I watched him take that throne. I watched what it cost him. And I've watched what 15 years of holding it has done to him. He turned back to her. He is not a gentleman. I want to be clear about that. He is hard and he is controlled and he has made decisions that I have disagreed with and said so and been listened to perhaps 40% of the time, which is more than most people get. He stopped. But he is not Malrek Voss. And if Voss finishes what he's building, the empire that comes out of it will be significantly worse than the one Valor built. You're asking me to accept the proposal, she said. I'm asking you to understand what you're walking into before you decide. He reached into his coat and set a folded document on the bench between them. This is a partial accounting of the coalition Voss has assembled. Names I've been able to confirm. I'm giving it to you rather than to the king because the king already knows most of it and has chosen not to move yet, and I need someone who can see it with fresh eyes. She looked at the document but did not touch it yet. Why not move against them? Because Voss has structured the coalition so that moving against any part of it triggers the rest. The king moves on Renlar, Renlar activates his Senate allies, Voss calls in his military agreements. 3 provinces go into open rebellion within a month. Casil's voice was even. It's a very elegant trap, built over 4 years by a man with nearly unlimited patience and resources. And you think my presence changes the calculus? I think your presence changes what the king is willing to risk. He said it quietly. I've never seen him give that dinner for a prospective match. He sits through those meals the way a man endures a formal obligation and then removes himself the instant courtesy allows. Last night he sat with you for nearly an hour after the council left. She absorbed that. That's not information I know what to do with, she said carefully. No, he agreed. But it's information worth having. She picked up the document and folded it and put it in her sleeve, in the same pocket where the original letter from the king had rested. She seemed to be accumulating a library of folded papers. If I accept, she said, and the coalition moves against the king, what does that mean for me specifically? It means you become a target, he said. You give the opposition a new pressure point, a new variable to threaten. He did not soften it. It won't be safe. I know, she said. I wasn't asking about safety. I was asking about the shape of what I'd be walking into so I could figure out how to walk into it correctly. Casil looked at her for a long moment. He's going to have a hard time with you, he said, and there was something in it that might have been approval. She stood, because the conversation had reached its natural end, and extending it would not produce more useful information. One more thing, she said. The servant girl who carried your note. Renlar had her by the wrist in the east corridor. She should be moved to duties that don't put her in his path. Casil's jaw tightened, barely, just enough to see. I'll see to it. She walked back through the formal gravel garden and into the palace corridors, and thought about everything Casil had told her with the focused attention of someone building an internal map of terrain they were about to cross. Every detail mattered. Every relationship was a vector. Every piece of information was a weight that could tip a balance she could not yet fully see the shape of. She had until tomorrow morning. She spent the afternoon in her chambers going through Casil's document with the systematic attention she had once given to the house accounts. Names, positions, the documented connections between them, the geography of it, which provinces, which military units, which trade relationships had been woven into the structure of the conspiracy. It was, as Casil had said, elegant, the kind of thing that required genuine intelligence to construct. Voss had not built a rebellion. He had built a system, and like all good systems, it was robust enough to survive the failure of individual components and patient enough to wait for the right moment. She thought about Veilor Draven's face across the firelit table, the tiredness in it, the quality of permanent vigilance that had become structural. There is a particular burden that people who are responsible for large things carry that ordinary ambition doesn't prepare you for, and it is this: the knowledge that your own failures are not private. They don't belong only to you. They radiate outward into the lives of everyone who is organized around what you are responsible for. A man who fails at his own business carries the weight of his own loss. A king who fails carries the weight of an empire's. 15 years of that weight, and no one to set it down with. She understood, looking at Casil's document, that this was not a simple calculation about survival anymore. Her house's survival was already secured. The grain was already sent. She could refuse the proposal and return to Everwyn and manage her house's slow reconstruction from a position of significantly improved stability. She could do that. She thought about 60 families instead of 200. She thought about a man who sent grain before the negotiation because he understood that some debts had to be paid before you knew whether they'd be returned. She thought about what it meant to share a philosophy with someone, even a stranger, even a hard and controlled and cold strategic thinker on an obsidian throne. She put Casil's document in the boot with the note and the knife. She had her answer. The question now was how to deliver it correctly. She requested an audience with the king the following morning at an hour that was early enough to signal intentionality, but not so early as to suggest urgency she did not want to perform. The request was granted within the hour. The king's private study, not the formal reception rooms. That distinction mattered. The study was in the North Tower, smaller than she had expected for a king's private workspace. Books on every wall, the organized kind that had been read rather than displayed, spines worn, pages marked. Maps on the working table, current ones, the edges annotated in a hand she assumed was his, a fire in the small grate. No gold in the room, no crystal, no marble. Just stone and wood and firelight and the dense accumulated texture of a room that was actually used rather than maintained for appearances. She had not expected that. He was standing at the table when she was shown in, reading something he set face down when she entered. He did not sit, neither did she. Lady Everwyn, he said. I've made my decision, she said. Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, but its adjacent cousin, the expression of someone who had prepared for a conversation and is now discovering the preparation was based on slightly incorrect premises. I'll accept, she said, under conditions. His expression stilled. I don't generally negotiate the terms of my proposals. I know, she said. I'm not negotiating. I'm informing you of what I require in order to be useful to you rather than ornamental. You can refuse them, but I'd ask you to hear them first. The silence stretched. Speak, he said. She kept her hands still at her sides and her voice level. I want full access to the councils I'm relevant to. Not ceremonial attendance, actual working access. If I'm going to function as a political partner rather than a symbol, I need information. The High Council won't accept that. Parts of the High Council, she said, are actively working against you. Their acceptance is not something I'm particularly concerned about. She watched his face very carefully when she said it and saw the thing she was looking for, not surprise. He already knew. Second, my household staff from Everwin. I want 6 people I know brought to the capital, not because I distrust palace staff, because I work better with people I've worked alongside before, and because you apparently have an intelligence infrastructure built into your staff that I'd rather not navigate blind until I understand it better. What? Something in his eyes sharpened. Third, she said, my brother has authority over the Everwin territories in my absence. Full authority, not provisional oversight from a crown administrator. Actual authority. If I'm here, I need to know my house is being managed by someone with real power to make decisions, not someone who has to ask the crown for permission to adjust grain distribution. The fire in the small grate shifted. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been busy, he said. I've been thinking, she said. It's what I do when I'm not sleeping. And you're not sleeping. Not especially, no. He moved away from the table toward the window, which looked out over the north courtyard where the morning light was flat and gray. He stood with his back to her for long enough that she began to consider whether she had miscalibrated the approach. Then he said, the council access will require management. I can't give you formal seat without a legislative process that will take months and will be actively contested by at least 3 members. I don't need a formal seat, she said to his back. I need to be in the rooms where the decisions are being made. The formality is secondary. The other 2 conditions, he said, still looking out the window, are acceptable. She breathed carefully. He turned from the window and looked at her and said, Elira Everwin, why are you actually doing this? The question landed with a weight that was different from the version she had answered at the dinner. This was not a king assessing a variable. This was something quieter and therefore harder, because things delivered quietly always require more precision in return. She held his gaze. Because I've spent 3 years watching everything my father built come apart, she said. And in that time I learned one thing that I can't unlearn. The worst outcomes don't come from enemies. They come from the absence of people willing to pay attention to what's breaking before it breaks completely. She paused. Your empire has enemies working inside it, and you know that, and you're managing it alone, and alone is not sufficient. She kept her voice even. I'm useful, and I'm here, and I'm not attached to any house that has a competing interest. That's rare. I'm not going to waste it. Vialor Draven looked at her. He had a way of looking at people, she was discovering. That was not the social kind of looking, not the looking that confirms you are present and being attended to. It was the looking that goes past the surface of what someone is presenting and presses on the structure underneath, testing for what is load-bearing and what is decoration. She let him look. Renlar moved against you last night, he said. I know. How do you know? Because he was in this corridor where a message was being delivered to me. She did not give him Casil. She did not know yet whether she needed to protect that particular resource. He wanted to know the contents before I did. He didn't succeed. What was in the message? A warning, she said, that I was not safe here. Were you told who sent it? No. He was quiet for a moment. And you came here anyway. I came here with my eyes open, she said. Which is different. Something crossed his face. A complicated thing, a thing that was not quite wonder but was in its neighborhood. The expression of a person who has been making calculations in a particular way for so long that encountering a different method produces something adjacent to disorientation. There's something I need to tell you, he said. His voice had changed, not the king's voice, something underneath that. The summit, he said, the Grand Imperial Summit, scheduled for the 2nd month. I've been planning it for 2 years. A gathering of all provincial governors, all senior military commanders, and a delegation of 6 foreign rulers. The stated purpose is a new trade compact and a renegotiation of the northern border arrangements. He paused. The actual purpose is to draw Voss and his coalition into the open in a controlled environment, under conditions where I have superior position. She absorbed this. And if it goes wrong, she said. If it goes wrong, he said evenly, within the span of that summit, I lose the throne, the empire fractures, and everything built in the past 15 years becomes rubble. She sat down then, because it seemed like information that warranted sitting down. You're telling me this, she said slowly. Before we have an agreement, before there is any formal commitment, you're telling me the most vulnerable strategic secret you have. Yes.
Why?
He looked at her steadily. Because you told me something last night, about debts that have to be paid before you know if they'll be returned. He held her gaze. I'm paying mine first. The fire in the small grate was the only sound in the room. She understood, in that moment, something that she suspected very few people had ever been close enough to Vaelor Draven to understand. The cost of what he had just done. Not the political cost, though that was real, the other cost. The cost to a man who had spent 15 years building control as his primary defense against a world that had shown him, early and thoroughly, that anyone he allowed to matter could be used against him. What he had just done was not strategic. It was the opposite of strategic, and he knew it. That was the thing that landed in her chest and stayed there, the knowledge that he knew exactly what he had done and had done it anyway. All right, she said. All right, he said back. She stood. One more thing. Renlar had your staff in that corridor. Not a servant who happened to be passing. Someone who was placed there to watch for exactly the kind of message I received. She met his eyes. Your intelligence infrastructure has a leak. Somewhere between the outer gate and the east wing, information about my arrival was feeding to the opposition within hours of my getting here. She paused. I don't know where it is, but I know what it looks like when a system has been compromised. I've been watching it in this palace since I arrived. Bom, Demis. Bom. Vaelor went very still. It was a different stillness from his normal controlled quiet. This was the stillness of a man who has just received information that reconfigures several other things he thought he understood. How long, he said, and his voice was very controlled. I can't say how long the leak has been there, she said. I can only tell you it's active and it's positioned well. She kept her voice steady. We should probably fix that before the summit. He looked at her. She looked back. Somewhere in the palace above them, the bells rang the change of the morning watch, and the sound of it moved through the stone walls with the particular resonance of things built to last. The wedding is in 3 weeks, he said finally. Not a question. That's very fast, she said. Yes, she breathed. All right. She was turning to leave when the door to the study opened without a knock, which was the kind of breach that did not happen by accident in a king's private rooms. The guard who stepped through was not the man who had escorted her in. He was younger, pale, with the look of someone who has been running and has not yet decided whether to hide the fact. Your Majesty. His voice had the tight quality of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. There's been an incident. Lord Senna's chambers. He paused. The Treasury Minister is dead, my lord. It appears to be poison. His morning correspondence included a letter with your seal. The temperature in the room dropped. That seal, Vaelor said, and his voice was flat and dangerous, is in my possession. Yes, my lord, the guard said. The letter had a copy. A very good copy. He hesitated. The letter contained an accusation, signed in your name, against Lord Casil. The Lyra went cold from the inside out. Vaelor did not move for 3 full seconds. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular and to everything at once, They're moving. 2 months before the summit, Alira said. He looked at her and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before. The thing underneath the control showing through the way bedrock shows through when the topsoil is stripped away. Not fear and not grief, but the raw functional fury of a man who has been playing a careful long game and has just watched his opponent flip the board. They're not moving toward the summit, she said. They're trying to prevent you from reaching it. She held his gaze. Sen is dead and Casil is being framed, and the forged seal tells everyone in this palace that the king killed one of his own council to silence the other. She breathed. Who finds that story believable? Anyone who already wants to believe it, he said. Then we have perhaps 4 hours before the narrative sets, she said. After that, it doesn't matter what the truth is. It only matters what story has taken root. She looked at him steadily. So what do you need me to do? Violor Draven looked at the 19-year-old woman standing in his private study, who had arrived in his palace 40 hours ago from a dying house at the edge of his empire, who had spent those 40 hours building a more accurate picture of his palace's internal politics than most of his senior staff possessed, who had just walked into a room with him, knowing the room contained the most dangerous secret in the empire, and had told him about his intelligence leak before he had offered her anything in return. Stay close, he said. Came out rougher than he intended. Less king, more man. She heard the difference. Close, she said. I can do that. Outside the study, in the corridors of Blackspire Palace, feet were already moving. Voices were already carrying the story from room to room. The machinery of a prepared narrative, activated at precisely the right moment, was beginning its work. And somewhere in the palace, Lord Renlar was listening to the sound of it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent 4 years building toward a single morning. He did not know that the morning had not gone entirely to plan. He did not know what had been said in the North Tower study. He did not know that the woman from the dying house at the edge of the empire had already started paying attention to the shape of what was breaking. He would find out. The 4 hours Elira had estimated were generous. They had 2. The story moved through Blackspire Palace the way fire moves through dry timber, not from a single point but from every point simultaneously, which told her everything she needed to know about how it had been constructed. Real news traveled linearly. It started somewhere and radiated outward in the recognizable pattern of information passing from mouth to mouth, each retelling slightly warmer than the last, slightly less precise. What was moving through the palace corridors that morning had no origin point. It arrived everywhere at once, fully formed, with the specific coherence of a narrative that had been written in advance and released rather than discovered. She noticed this while moving through the outer reception corridor with Violor and 2 of his personal guard, and she filed it alongside everything else she was filing, because there was not yet time to analyze, and the analysis would have to wait for a moment when the ground stopped shifting. The Treasury Ministry occupied a suite of rooms in the palace's western wing, and by the time they reached it, the corridor outside was already populated with the particular collection of people who appear at the site of a crisis before the crisis has been officially confirmed. Senior staff, junior staff, pretending to be useful, and 3 members of the High Council who had materialized with a speed that suggested prior notification. Renlar was one of them. He stood near the door with the careful composure of a man who has rehearsed this moment, his expression arranged into the correct mixture of shock and grave concern, which was a very convincing performance and would have been more convincing to Elira if she had not seen his face in the alcove the previous night and understood what lived underneath the arrangement. Harwick was there as well, the Chancellor, older and more genuinely shaken-looking, though whether that was real or professional, she could not yet determine. And Lord Morton, the Eastern Province's administrator, who stood slightly apart from the others with his arms folded and his face doing nothing at all, which was itself a kind of expression. Valor walked into the room without looking at any of them. She followed. Lord Senna was at his desk. He looked, from the doorway, like a man who had fallen asleep at his work, which was the particular cruel mercy that certain poisons offered, a gentle appearance to a brutal fact. He was 61 years old. He had spent 30 years in Imperial Treasury service. He had been meticulous and lean and careful with language in the way of people who spent their lives managing numbers. And he had given her a look at dinner the previous night that she had categorized as measuring, but not hostile. The letter was on the desk beside him, face up, which meant someone had placed it that way after the fact, because a man dying at his correspondence would not have arranged his final moments for visual impact. Valor read it without touching it. Elira read it over his shoulder. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Imperial stationery. The seal at the bottom was, as the guard had said, a very good copy, good enough that she could see why it had been accepted. The first paragraph named Lord Cassil as the architect of a conspiracy against the crown. The second paragraph claimed that Lord Senna had discovered evidence of this conspiracy and was being silenced before he could bring it forward. The third paragraph, in what she recognized as a stylistic flourish designed to compound the damage, suggested that the discovery had come too late and expressed what it framed as the king's personal regret for the necessity of the action. It was considered purely as a constructed artifact Genuinely excellent work. The tone was close to accurate. The vocabulary was close to accurate. Whoever had studied Vylor Draven's written communication long enough to replicate it had been doing so for months, possibly longer. My lord. Renlar's voice came from the doorway, measured and heavy with performed grief. This is a grave matter. The council will need to convene immediately. The council will convene when I call it, Vylor said, without turning. Given the nature of the accusations, when I call it. He turned then, and the quality of his stillness was something that a room full of people felt before they processed it consciously. The specific gravity of a person whose anger has gone past the temperature where it makes noise. Lord Castle is to be brought to my private council chamber, unharmed. If I find that he has been detained or interfered with by anyone before he reaches that room, I will consider it an act of treason and respond accordingly. Renlar's expression did something brief and controlled. Of course, my lord. Though protocol would suggest, Lord Renlar. Vylor's voice was entirely level. I am the protocol. He walked out. Alira followed. She did not look at Renlar as she passed him, which was a deliberate choice. Looking at him would have told him he was on her map. Not looking at him told him nothing, which was more useful. The private council chamber was a smaller room than the formal one, paneled in dark wood, with a long table and 8 chairs and no windows. When Cassil was brought in 12 minutes later, he was pale but steady, with the look of a man who had been expecting something like this, and was now engaged in the practical work of managing it, rather than the emotional work of reacting to it. Sit, Vylor said. Cassil sat. He looked at Alira once, a brief measuring look, and then back to the king. Tell me, Vylor said, everything you know about the letter. I know I didn't write it, Cassil said. I know Sene and I had no conflict. I know whoever constructed this knew I had been feeding you information about the coalition, because the specific accusations in that letter reference meetings that only someone with internal intelligence access could have known about. He stopped. Which means the leak in your intelligence network is not peripheral. It's close to the center. The room held that for a moment. How close? Vylor said. Close enough to know what I told you, and when I told you, Cassil said. And close enough to time this precisely, the morning after Lady Everwyn arrived, the morning after she met with me in the garden. He held the king's gaze. They know she's been getting information. They're trying to remove the people who gave it to her before she can use it. Alira had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it said aloud reorganized the architecture slightly, because if the opposition knew about the garden meeting quickly enough to use it as a trigger point for this morning's action, the leak was not merely positioned well. It was watching them in something close to real time. Someone in your immediate staff, she said. Both men looked at her. Not a courier, she said. Not a general network position. Someone who knew about the garden meeting within hours of its happening. That means someone who either overheard it directly or had a source who did. She thought about the palace corridors, the formal gravel, the geometric hedges, the garden that was all visibility and no concealment. The garden itself. We were visible the whole time. Anyone in the overlooking windows in the north residential section could have seen us meet. Who has rooms in the north residential section? Cassil said, and it was not quite a question. Senior staff, Vylor said. Council members, 3 of my personal advisors. His jaw tightened. And their households. We need to move carefully, Alira said. If we start pulling threads visibly, whoever is watching will know we've identified the vector, and they'll close it before we can follow it anywhere useful. Vylor looked at her. You're talking about letting it run. I'm talking about feeding it something controlled, she said. Letting them think they know what we know and what we're planning, while what we're actually planning is happening somewhere they're not watching. The silence in the room was the particular silence of people recalibrating. Cassil said quietly, That's very cold. Yes, she said. It is. Vylor studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a complicated thing that she could not fully read and did not have time to try. What do you need? Time. 3 days, and the ability to move through this palace without my movements being managed by palace protocol. She met his gaze steadily. If I'm accompanied by official escorts, I'm visible. I need to be able to go places without a record of having gone there. He was quiet for a moment. I'll give you Petra. Who's Petra? My personal cipher, he said. She's been with me for 9 years. She knows this palace the way water knows drainage, and she moves through it without leaving a mark. He held her gaze. She's the only person in this building whose loyalty I would stake everything on. Then she's exactly who I need, Elira said. The 3 days that followed were the most demanding of Elira's life, and she had spent 3 years managing a house's collapse, which had not been easy. The difference was that a collapsing house failed gradually, giving you time to adapt. What she was moving through now failed in layers, each layer revealing another layer underneath, and the pace of it did not allow for the steady, methodical approach she preferred. Petra was a small, compact woman of perhaps 35, unremarkable in the specific way that is itself a skill, the kind of face that rooms forgot as soon as she left them. She spoke rarely and precisely and moved through the palace with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent years understanding the rhythm of every corridor's traffic and had calibrated herself to it so completely that she had become part of it, invisible, the way background is invisible. She showed Elira the palace the way maps could not the official layout, but the living topology of it, where the traffic thinned at which hours, which staff reported to which supervisors, which corridors were visible from which windows, and which were not. The negative spaces. The functional blind spots that every large structure accumulated over time. The places that existed in the records but not in anyone's daily attention. On the second day, working through Petra's access to the staff assignment records, Elira found the thread. It was a small thing. A reassignment, 6 weeks ago, of a junior records clerk from the administrative offices to the household staff of Lord Harwick. On its own, unremarkable. Junior staff moved between departments routinely. But the clerk in question had been originally assigned to the Imperial Cipher Office, which was the department responsible for managing the King's Seal and correspondence protocols. A Cipher Office clerk reassigned to a council member's household. 6 weeks before a forged seal appeared on a murder letter was not a coincidence. She told Petra. Petra was quiet for 11 seconds. Then she said, Harwick. Not necessarily Harwick directly, Elira said, but someone in his household who has been placed there. Which means Harwick is either complicit or compromised, Petra said. Either his household has been infiltrated without his knowledge, or he allowed the placement. Which version is worse? Petra looked at her steadily. If he's infiltrated, we can work around him. If he's complicit, he's been feeding the coalition intelligence from inside the High Council for 6 weeks at minimum. She paused. The Chancellor of the Empire, Lady Everwyn. Elira sat with that. She brought it to Valor on the evening of the second day. She had been meeting with him briefly each evening, exchanges of information rather than conversation, the functional kind that stripped everything to its operational essentials. She noticed that he had stopped performing the distance that had characterized their first meeting. Not warmth exactly, more like the dropping of an energy expenditure that had become unnecessary, the way a person stops bracing in a room once they're confident the ceiling will hold. She told him about the cipher clerk and the Harwick connection. He stood at the window of the North Tower study for a long time. Harwick, he said. Not loud. The flat, excavated tone of a man processing information that rewrites the past. I don't have confirmation yet, she said. I have a strong thread. How strong? Strong enough that I'd act on it if the cost of being wrong was low. She paused. The cost of being wrong here is not low. No, he said. It isn't. He turned from the window. There was something in his face that was older than his age, the specific age that comes from being let down by the people you calculated you could trust. Harwick has been with me since year 3, before most of the current Senate was elected, before the last 2 border treaties. He stopped. If he's been running information to Voss for 6 weeks, Voss knows the summit's internal protocols, the guest list, the security arrangements. Yes, she said, the summit cannot proceed as planned. No, she said, but it also cannot be canceled. Cancellation signals that you know the plan has been compromised. It removes the controlled environment you've been building toward and scatters the coalition back into positions you can't see. So we proceed into a compromised summit, he said. We proceed into a summit where we know it's compromised and they don't know that we know, she said, which is a different situation entirely. He looked at her. You understand, he said carefully, That what you're describing requires us to walk deliberately into a situation designed to destroy us, relying on the margin created by one piece of intelligence that we haven't fully confirmed. Yes, she said. I do understand that. And I think the alternative is worse. She held his gaze. If Voss moves the timeline again because the summit is canceled, he moves into territory you can't predict. The trap he's built is designed for the summit. Outside that controlled environment, you're reacting rather than acting, and reactive is not where you want to be against someone who's had 4 years to prepare. Vaelor Draven looked at the woman across the study from him, the 19-year-old from the dying house at the edge of his empire who had arrived 3 days ago, knowing almost nothing about the internal politics of Blackspire Palace, and who was now standing in his private study telling him the most strategically precise assessment of his situation he had heard in months. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to people at the top of any structure, and it is not the loneliness of the ordinary kind. It is not the absence of company. It is the absence of accurate mirrors. The people around power almost always show it a version of itself shaped by what they want from it, what they fear from it, what they believe it wants to see. The higher you rise, the more complete the distortion becomes. And you can know it intellectually. You can tell yourself you see through it, but the knowing does not give you back what has been taken, which is the simple experience of being seen without the lens of what you represent. He had spent 15 years navigating by distorted mirrors. She was showing him the thing itself. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the most destabilizing thing anyone had done to him in years. And it destabilized him not because it was hostile, but because it was not. The wedding, he said. The council is expecting it to proceed at the end of the week. Then it should, she said. The coalition needs to believe nothing has changed. If we alter the timeline, Renlar will register the shift. And if we proceed, he said, you become a formal target, not a potential variable, a confirmed one. She held his gaze without flinching. I became a target the night I arrived. Proceeding just makes it official. He nodded once, the motion of a man closing a door on a consideration that was no longer operational. There's one more thing, she said. Something in her voice changed quality, barely perceptibly, and he registered it the way he registered everything, with the full attention of a man whose survival had depended for 15 years on reading small signals accurately. I confirmed the Harwick connection this afternoon, she said. The cipher clerk has been meeting with a contact from Voss's household 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Late hours. In the South Market District outside the palace grounds. She paused. Petra found the meeting records in the market quarter's night watch logs. All right, he said. The clerk's most recent meeting was yesterday morning, she said, before Senna died. The room went very still. He was fed information about the summit's security arrangements, she said, specifically about the guest arrival protocols and the internal guard rotations for the summit chamber. She kept her voice absolutely level. Valor, someone inside the summit security is working for Voss, not just informing, actively positioned. He crossed to the table in 3 steps and braced both hands flat against it and looked at the map surface beneath them, and she watched him do the arithmetic she had already done, running through the implications in the systematic way of someone who had built an empire through understanding exactly how far the consequences of a single compromise position could reach. The summit chamber, he said, quiet and precise and cold as stone. Yes, she said. Then the summit isn't a trap I've been setting for them, he said. It's a trap they've been setting for me. It was always both, she said. You've both been building toward the same room. The question is who walks out of it. He straightened. When he looked at her, his face had done the thing she had seen once before, the bedrock showing through. But this time it was different. Not the reactive fury of the morning Senna died. Something more deliberate. The look of a man who has reached the point where the weight of careful management has exceeded its utility, where the only honest response is to set it down and pick up something harder. I need to know every name, he said. I know, she said, and then I need to decide what to do with them. I know. He held her gaze. I may need to do things you don't agree with. Possibly, she said. I'll tell you when I disagree, and then I'll support the decision you make, because this is your empire and your throne, and my disagreement doesn't change what has to be done. She paused. But I'll tell you. He was quiet for a moment. No one has told me when they disagreed for a very long time,
he said. I know, she said, for the third time, but this time with a different weight. The evening deepened around them, and outside the North Tower the palace continued its performances, the formal suppers and the corridor conversations, and the careful choreography of people who did not yet know what was moving beneath the surface of the day. Renlar was somewhere in that performance, working the social infrastructure with the patience of a man who believed his moment was 6 weeks away and was simply maintaining position until it arrived. He did not know what had been found in the cipher records. He did not know that the meeting logs in the South Market Quarter had been photographed by Petra before dawn that morning. He did not know that in the North Tower study, the two people he had been working to separate had instead, in 3 days, built something that his 4 years of careful construction had not anticipated and could not now easily dismantle. What happened next is the thing about power structures that even their builders forget, that they are never as permanent as they feel from the inside. The most complete system of control, the most patient and elegantly constructed conspiracy, has one irreducible vulnerability. It is built by people, and people cannot fully account for what they cannot imagine. Voss had imagined a frightened woman from a dying house. He had imagined an isolated king facing his enemies alone. He had not imagined the particular chemistry of what happened when those two specific people sat across from each other in a firelit room and recognized in the other the same essential machinery. The wedding proceeded on the appointed day. It was a formal ceremony in the imperial court, witnessed by the High Council, the senior military staff, and a selection of foreign dignitaries who would carry the news of it back to their respective courts. Elira wore the best dress she had brought, which was not spectacular but was precise, and she stood in the great ceremonial hall under the crystal chandeliers and said the words that were required of her with the same steady voice she used for everything that mattered. She looked at Veilor once during the ceremony, a brief, direct look that carried more information than the formal words did, a look that said, I see the weight you're carrying, and I am not going to pretend it isn't heavy. He looked back at her, and what she saw in his face was not the king's face. It was the face of a person who has been expecting to carry something alone for so long that the simple fact of someone standing beside him had become, in itself, a kind of vertigo. The council watched from their designated positions. Renlar's face was excellent. She would give him that. The celebration dinner afterward was a performance that both she and Veilor sustained with the full professionalism of people who understood that every face in that room was reading them for information, and that the information those faces carried back to their various principals would shape what happened next. She ate and accepted congratulations, and spoke with the foreign dignitaries and felt the formal weight of the occasion settling around her like a new climate. She was queen. The word had not fully arrived yet. She suspected it would take time, the way large things always took time to become real. 2 days later, Petra brought her the final piece. The summit security roster complete. Every guard assignment, every entrance protocol, every position in the chamber. And there, in the rotation for the king's personal security during the summit's opening address, a name she had not seen in any of the previous documents. A name that connected not to Voss's household, and not to Renlar, and not to any of the nodes she had been mapping. A name that connected to the king's own family. She sat with that for a long time. The king had a younger brother, half-brother, technically, from his father's second marriage. Dorian Draven, 33 years old, who had been given administrative governance of the northern coastal provinces 11 years ago, and who had been, by every account Elira had encountered, a loyal and unambitious figure who managed his territories competently and appeared at formal occasions without causing incident. The name on the security roster was his household captain. She thought about what it meant that Voss had reached inside the Draven family. She thought about what it meant for Veilor, specifically to learn that the conspiracy had extended there. There is a particular cruelty to betrayal that distinguishes it from ordinary harm, and it is this. Ordinary harm comes from outside and can be defended against, even if imperfectly. Betrayal comes from inside the perimeter you built with trust, and it does not announce itself. It waits until the moment you are most reliant on the thing it has corrupted, and then it turns. The damage of betrayal is not just the harm done. It is the retroactive contamination of every moment of faith that preceded it. Every memory of trust becomes evidence of blindness. Every extension of confidence becomes proof of failure. Veilor Draven had built his entire system of power on the understanding that he could not afford that kind of blindness.
He had controlled his affiliations with absolute precision. He had refused attachment as a strategic principle. He had constructed his isolation as deliberately as another man might construct armor. And still, they had found the gap. Because isolation is not the same as safety. An undefended perimeter is simply a perimeter without witnesses. And a man who has spent 15 years refusing to let anyone close enough to betray him has also spent 15 years refusing to let anyone close enough to warn him. She went to him that night. She told him about the security roster and the name. She watched him receive it. He did not speak for a long time. He stood at the window of the study and looked at the dark courtyard below and breathed with the controlled steadiness of a man who has extensive experience deciding whether what he is feeling is allowed to be real. She did not try to fill the silence. She understood by now something about the quality of his silences, which ones were processing and which ones were deciding, and this one was both, the kind that required its full space. When he finally turned from the window, his face was the bedrock face, the one beneath the control, and what was in it was not the cold fury of a king whose plans had been threatened. It was something older and more human than that. The face of a person who has just confirmed a fear they had been carrying in their peripheral vision for a long time and had been hoping, quietly, to be wrong about. Dorian didn't know, he said. It was not a question. It was a decision he had made, and the decision told her something about him that all the previous days had only approached. I don't know that, she said honestly. I do, he said. She held his gaze. Even if he didn't know, his household captain was placed there by Voss. That placement required access. Dorian's household is not accessible to outside influence without Dorian's knowledge or significant failure of his own internal security. I know, Valor said, which means either he was used or he was complicit. I know what it means. His voice was not harsh. It was the voice of a man stating a fact that he has accepted and would not accept again. Tell me what you need from me to confirm which it is before the summit. She looked at him. This was the thing that distinguished him, she thought. Not the power or the control or the cold strategic intelligence, all of which were real and considerable. This, that even in the moment of being hit with the specific information he was least equipped to receive without reaction, he asked what was needed next. He did not perform his pain. He did not require management. He took the blow and converted it to action with the speed of a person who had been doing exactly that for 15 years, because there had never been anyone to absorb the impact for him. There had never been anyone to absorb it with him. Until now. I need 3 days, she said, and I need you to let me move without knowing where I'm going. He looked at her steadily. You're asking me to trust you completely, he said. Yes, she said. I am. The word landed between them with the full weight of everything it cost him. 3 days, he said. She nodded. She was turning to leave when he said her name, not her title. Her name, the way he had said it once before, without the king's voice. Elira. She stopped. If this summit goes wrong, he said. If it goes the way Voss has built it to go. He paused, and she understood that what followed was not easy, and that he was saying it anyway. I need you to know that everything I told you in this room, the summit plan, Cassil, the grain, all of it, I would do it again the same way. She turned. He was looking at her directly, with the bedrock face, without performance. Paying the debt first, she said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then so would I. She left. In the corridor outside, the palace breathed around her, its routines and its currents and its careful performed normalcy, and she walked through it with her hands at her sides and the weight of the next 3 days already calculating in her chest. The specific cold clarity spreading from her center outward that arrived when everything unnecessary burned away. 5 days to the summit. 1 traitor confirmed. 1 possible. A compromised security position at the king's side during his most exposed moment. A coalition that had been building for 4 years and had just lost patience. And underneath all of it, the question that no amount of intelligence gathering could fully answer, at the moment when Voss made his move, and the careful architecture of preparation met the reality of an open room full of armed people and calculated violence, what would hold and what would break? She did not know. What she knew was this. She had spent 3 years watching things break and learning, slowly and at real cost, how to stand inside the breaking without being broken herself. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered now. She pressed her thumb into the heel of her palm and breathed. 4 days to prepare for a room that had been designed by very patient and very dangerous people to be the last room the Iron Wolf ever walked out of. She started planning. The 3 days passed the way the worst 3 days always pass, not slowly, but in fragments, each one carrying more weight than the last, the kind of time that cannot be measured in hours, because the hours themselves have different densities depending on what they contain. Elira slept 4 hours each night and spent the rest in motion. Petra moved with her through the palace's blind spots and documented everything that moved in the wrong direction, every staff member whose rhythm varied from its established pattern, every communication that went out of the palace at an unusual hour, every face that appeared in a corridor where it had no functional reason to be. It was painstaking work, the kind that produced no dramatic revelations, only the slow accumulation of pattern, and pattern, reliably read, was more useful than revelation because revelation arrived too late to act on. On the second day, she confirmed Dorian Draven's status. He had not known. The household captain, a man named Severon, had been placed in Dorian's service 8 months ago through a recommendation from a northern trade consortium that Voss's family controlled through 3 intermediary companies. Dorian had accepted the recommendation because the man came with an excellent service record and because Dorian, by every indication Elira could gather, was genuinely what he appeared to be, a competent, unambitious administrator who had inherited his father's inclination toward institutional order without inheriting his father's appetite for power. He had been used as a door. She brought this to Valor on the second evening and watched something shift in his face, the private kind of shift, the one that happened below the operational layer. "He'll need to be told," she said. "I know. Before the summit, he needs to know Severin is compromised, and he needs to be managed carefully enough that he doesn't react in a way that alerts Voss." "Dorian doesn't react visibly," Valor said. "He never has." A pause. "He's going to take this hard." "I know," she said. "But taking it hard quietly is exactly what we need." She sent Petra to carry a private message to Dorian's quarters that night. The message was 6 words. Severin was placed. Trust no one. It was signed with the Queen's seal, which she had been given at the wedding and had used for nothing else yet, and which Dorian would recognize as a signal from the king's immediate household, even if the source was new to him. On the 3rd day, 1 hour before the summit began, she had the complete picture. 11 names, 3 on the High Council, including Renlar and, as confirmed, Harwick. 2 senior military commanders with authority over the palace garrison, 4 provincial governors whose territories Voss had been cultivating for years. 1 foreign dignitary whose presence at the summit had been arranged specifically to provide external witness to what was planned to happen in the chamber. And Severon, positioned at the king's right shoulder during the opening address, with a blade small enough to pass the standard security sweep and large enough to do what was needed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which was always the signature of genuinely dangerous planning. In the complexity of a summit gathering, with hundreds of attendees and the natural chaos of a major diplomatic event, the death of a king could look like many things for long enough that the coalition could establish the narrative they preferred before the truth had time to compete with it. She laid the complete picture out for Valor in the North Tower study at dawn. He stood at the table and looked at it for a long time. 11, he said. 11 confirmed, she said. There may be more peripheral figures whose roles are operational rather than structural. I've documented what I could confirm. He studied the list. She watched his face do the work of assimilation, absorbing each name against 15 years of history with it, recalibrating retroactively, the specific labor of a person rewriting a documented past in light of a newly revealed truth. Harwick's name sat in the middle of the list. He looked at it for longer than the others. 31 years, he said. Not to her, not to anyone particularly. She said nothing. He was there when I took the throne, he said. He advised the first council session. He helped draft the provincial governance reforms. He stopped. He was at my father's funeral. Yes, she said quietly, and for 6 weeks he's been feeding the details of my summit security to a man who wants me dead. Yes. He straightened from the table. The operational face came back over the bedrock one. not concealing it but overlaying it with the functional necessary layer of a man who cannot afford to stay in the feeling when there is work still ahead. "Tell me the countermeasures," he said. She told him. The summit chamber was a large formal space built for exactly this kind of gathering, with a high vaulted ceiling and rows of tiered seating arranged around a central floor where the speaking positions were marked. The king's position was at the front of the chamber, elevated slightly on a speaking platform, flanked by his personal guard. Severon's assigned position was 2 steps behind the king's right shoulder. What Severin did not know was that his assignment had been quietly altered at midnight. The reassignment was logged as a routine rotation adjustment, unremarkable in the volume of administrative processing that a summit of this scale generated. The man who would stand 2 steps behind the king's right shoulder would be one of Petra's people, wearing Severin's duty insignia. Severon would be rerouted to an outer corridor position, where he would be detained quietly by 2 of Cassil's people the moment the summit chamber doors closed. The coalition members in the chamber would be allowed to take their seats. The foreign dignitary, whose role was to witness and certify a particular version of events, would be seated in the position assigned to him, which was a good position for observation and a poor one for egress. At the moment Voss made his move, which she and Valor had calculated would come during the opening address, when the chamber was at its most formally structured and the king was at his most exposed, there would be 32 soldiers in positions the coalition had not mapped, because those positions had been coordinated through Cassil's private channel rather than the compromised official security infrastructure, and no one on the compromised list had known about Cassil's channel. It was not a perfect plan. Perfect plans required information they did not have. There were variables she could not control, timing she could not fully anticipate, the irreducible unpredictability of what happened when a prepared confrontation met living reality. But it was the best plan available. And Elira had learned in 3 years of managing a house's decline that the best plan available was the only plan worth executing. Everything else was the luxury of people who had not yet learned how thin the margin between functioning and disaster actually was. "One thing," she said when she had finished laying out the countermeasures. Valor looked at her. "Voss will be in the chamber," she said. "He's on the official guest list as a provincial dignitary, and there's no pretext to exclude him that won't signal what we know. When this breaks open, he will attempt to present himself as the legitimate response to a crisis rather than its architect." She held the king's gaze. "You need to be the one who names him, publicly, in the chamber, in front of every witness present, before he has the opportunity to control the narrative. And if I name him, and the evidence isn't immediately visible to everyone in that room, then we make it visible," she said. "I've prepared a summary document, 11 names, 11 documented connection points, the cipher clerk records, the meeting logs, the forged seal comparison against your actual correspondence archive." She set the document on the table. "Every delegate in that chamber will receive a copy." He looked at the document. "You've been preparing this for 3 days," he said. "Since the second day," she said, "when I confirmed Harwick. Once I knew the scale of it, I knew the chamber would be where it ended, one way or another. The documentation needed to exist before the room happened." He was quiet for a moment. "Elira," he said. She waited. "If something goes wrong in that chamber today, don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't brief me on contingencies," she said. "I know the contingencies. I've been living in them for 3 days." She kept her voice level and direct. "We're going to walk into that chamber, and we're going to end this, and we're going to do it together, and that's the plan." The silence stretched between them for a moment that was its own complete thing, neither long nor short, just full. "All right," he said. They walked to the summit chamber together. The corridor leading to it was wide and high-ceilinged, lined with the imperial banners in silver and black, and as they walked through it, Elira was aware of the weight of what she was carrying. Not fear, exactly. Something more functional than fear. The hyper-present awareness of a person moving through the final approach to a known decision point, every sensory detail sharpening into clarity, the cold stone under her feet through the thin soles of her formal shoes, the sound of the ventilation in the ceiling, the smell of candle wax, and something underneath it that was the dense accumulated smell of a building that had been holding power for a very long time. She thought about Kyle and Everwin, managing the grain distribution and the eastern tenants, and the 100 small administrative decisions that kept a house alive. She thought about 60 families who were now 200 again. She thought about the debt that had already been paid. She pressed her thumb into her palm and breathed. The summit chamber doors opened. The room was full. Provincial governors, military commanders, foreign dignitaries, senior administrative officials, the members of the High Council in their designated positions, and at the far end of the tiered seating, Lord Malrek Voss, 60 years old, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with the settled authority of a man who had spent 4 years building toward this morning and was now occupying it with the patience of someone watching a clock tick down to a predetermined conclusion. He looked at Veilor when the king entered. Then he looked at Elira. Something in his expression adjusted, a small recalibration, there and gone. She filed it. The opening formalities proceeded. The summit protocol was elaborate and precise, established over decades of diplomatic precedent, and it moved with the formal momentum of a structure that had been designed to be impressive and to convey, through its own procedural weight, the seriousness of what happened within it. Elira sat in her designated position to the king's right and watched the room with the same systematic attention she had given everything in the past 3 days, reading the faces, reading the positions, reading the specific quality of stillness in the people who were waiting for something rather than attending to something. Renlar was in his council seat. His face was perfect. Harwick, 2 seats from Renlar, had aged 10 years since the night Senna died. Or perhaps she was only now reading what had always been there. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a performance for months and is very close to the moment when the performance can end one way or another. Lord Morton was absent. She noticed this immediately and processed it. Morton had been on her list as a peripheral figure, not confirmed as a coalition member, but associated through documented relationships with 2 of the confirmed names. His absence from a summit he was formally required to attend was either illness or a decision. Given the timing, she catalogued it as a decision, which meant either he had broken with the coalition at the last moment, or he had been extracted to a position where he could not be caught in the aftermath. She sent a look to Casil, who was in his council seat and who had a line of sight to the side entrance. He caught her look and gave a fractional nod that said he had already noted the absence and had people checking. The opening address began. Veilor moved to the speaking platform with the complete physical authority of a man who had been the most dangerous thing in every room he'd entered for 15 years, and who had learned in those 15 years that the most effective display of power was the absence of its performance. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture for emphasis. He spoke with the level precision of a man who expected to be heard, and had never had cause to doubt that expectation. He was 3 minutes into the address when Voss moved. Not physically. Not yet. The move was verbal, the kind of first move that framed the space before the physical consequences arrived, the kind that Elira had been waiting for because it was exactly what she would have done in his position. "My Lord King." Voss's voice, carrying across the chamber with the practiced projection of a man who had been speaking in formal settings for 40 years. "Before we proceed, I must raise a matter of urgent imperial concern." The room stilled. Veilor stopped speaking. He turned to look at Voss with the complete unrushed attention of a man who has been expecting this and has decided to give it its full weight. "Lord Voss," he said. "The matter of Lord Senna's death," Voss said, "which this assembly cannot in good conscience proceed without addressing." He rose from his seat, which was a formal claim on the room's attention, and the room gave it to him because the room did not yet know what he was. A forged letter bearing the king's seal, an accusation against a council member, a treasury official dead at his desk. He paused, letting it spread. This assembly deserves clarity before it proceeds with the business of empire. Several governors shifted in their seats. 2 foreign dignitaries exchanged looks. The machinery of a prepared narrative, activated by a skilled operator in a room full of people who were receiving information rather than interrogating it. "You're right," Veilor said. The room went very quiet. "This assembly does deserve clarity." He held Voss's gaze across the chamber. "Let me provide it." He turned to Elira. She stood. The room's attention shifted. She felt it as a physical thing, the weight of 200 people's focus, and she took it the way she had been trained to take things that were heavy. Not by bracing against it, but by letting it pass through and settling into a stance that could hold it. She nodded to the doors. Casil's people entered. 20 of them, distributed through the chamber's side and rear entrances, moving with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who have been briefed and are executing rather than deciding. Each delegate and dignitary received a document. It took 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, the quality of silence in the room changed from the silence of people being managed to the silence of people beginning to read. "What you're receiving," Elira said, and her voice was steady and clear in the formal acoustics of the chamber, "is a documented account of a conspiracy against the Empire, compiled over 3 days from the palace's own records. 11 names, 11 documented positions within the coalition that has been building for 4 years under the direction of Lord Malrek Voss." She looked directly at Voss. "The same coalition that placed a man with a concealed blade at the king's right shoulder this morning, who has already been detained." The room erupted, not all at once. Not the single explosion of a crowd startled simultaneously, but in layers. Different sections of the chamber processing at different speeds. The foreign dignitaries first, because they had the least investment in any particular outcome and could respond to pure information. Then the military commanders. Then the governors. And underneath it all, the very particular silence of the 11 names on the document, each of them absorbing what it meant to be listed in a room full of witnesses with evidence in their hands. Renlar stood. "This is fabrication," he said, loudly, clearly, the voice of a man who is prepared for this possibility and is executing the response. "The Queen is a political appointment 3 weeks old. The sources she is citing are Lord Renlar." Valor's voice cut through the room like a blade through water, not loud, not raised, simply absolute. "Sit down." Renlar did not sit. "The king," he said, and his voice was shifting now, moving from the performance of outrage to something underneath it, the actual structure of what he'd been building toward, has spent 15 years consolidating power in this empire through fear and force. What you are witnessing today is the final expression of that consolidation. A manufactured crisis. A purge of the voices in this assembly that have had the courage to... Valor descended from the speaking platform. He walked through the chamber floor toward Renlar, and the room parted for him the way rooms had always parted for him, not because of the guards flanking him, but because of what he was, the specific gravity of him at full operational intensity with nothing left to manage around, no more careful distances, no more strategic calculation about the cost of visibility, just the absolute undiluted fact of a man who has reached the point where the weight of restraint has become more dangerous than the weight of action. He stopped 10 feet from Renlar. "You killed Senna," he said. Quiet. Precise as surgery. "You forged my seal. You placed an assassin at my side this morning, and you have been feeding the details of this empire's internal security to a man who has been preparing to fracture it for 4 years. He held Renlar's gaze without blinking. "Tell me which part of that is fabrication." Renlar's performance held for 3 more seconds. Then it broke. Not dramatically. It broke the way ice breaks from multiple small points simultaneously, the structure going first and the surface following, and what came through the break was not the careful, composed council lord, but the man underneath, the one who had been living in the performance for so long that the performance had become load-bearing, and now without it, there was nothing holding the weight. "You were going to destroy everything," Renlar said, and his voice had lost its shape, raw and strange, the voice of a man speaking from a place he had kept walled off. "Everything this empire was built on, the balance of power, the traditional structures, 15 years of pulling authority toward the throne until the provinces were—" "The provinces are fed," Valor said. "The borders are held. The trade routes that hadn't functioned in 40 years before I took the throne are functioning. The wars you managed before my reign killed 3 times the soldiers mine have." His voice did not rise. "You didn't act against me because I was failing. You acted against me because I was succeeding in ways that reduced your leverage." The room was absolutely still. Renlar looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down. Not in defeat exactly, in the specific way of a man who has expended everything he had prepared and found it insufficient and has nothing left to spend. Voss had not moved. He sat in his position at the far end of the tier with the settled quality of a man who had watched a portion of his plan come apart and was now calculating the remaining architecture, the parts that might still hold, the contingencies built into a 4-year construction. He was 60 years old, and he had not built what he had built by having only one plan. Elira saw it before it happened. The foreign dignitary in the good observation position with the poor egress. She had calculated him as a witness function. She had been wrong. He was not there to witness. He was there to deliver something, and she saw his hand go into his formal coat and understood in the fraction of a second before the action completed what was in the coat and what it was going to do. Down, she said. She said it to Valor, but she was already moving because the word and the movement had the same origin point, and she had not calculated them separately, and the room had not yet processed what was happening when she crossed the 3 steps between her position and his and put herself in the line between the dignitary's position and where Valor was standing. The blade, thrown with the practiced accuracy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, caught her in the left shoulder instead of the king's back. The pain was white and immediate, and she registered it the way she registered everything in those kinds of seconds, as information rather than experience, something to be processed and acted on rather than felt. She did not go down. She kept her feet because going down in that room in that moment would have communicated exactly the wrong thing to exactly the wrong people. The chamber detonated. Casil's soldiers moved. The dignitary was subdued before he could retrieve a second weapon from wherever the first had come from. 3 of the 11 names on the document attempted to reach the exits and found them blocked. The room filled with the particular controlled chaos of a prepared response meeting an unexpected variable, which was never clean and was never silent and was always, in the end, determined by whether the people executing the response had been better briefed than the people they were containing. They had been better briefed. Valor reached her in the same moment she registered the blade in her shoulder. His hand came to her arm, steadying, and the contact was not the formal, careful distance of the previous 3 days. It was the grip of a person who has just watched something happen that has reorganized everything. "I'm standing," she said, because she needed him to know that first. "I can see that," he said, and his voice was doing something she had not heard it do before, a roughness in it that had nothing to do with command. "The shoulder," she said. "It's not deep. It caught the edge." She knew this because she could feel the specific quality of the pain, which was sharp and clean rather than the deeper wrong feeling of something that had gone where it should not go. The blade had been thrown from distance through a partially turned body. The angle had been imperfect. She had moved in time to prevent the worst of it and had not moved in time to prevent all of it. She pressed her right hand to the wound and held the pressure and looked at the room, which Casil's people were managing with the methodical efficiency of a prepared operation reaching its execution phase. Voss was still in his seat. He had not moved through any of it, which told her everything about his calculation. He had known the throwing blade was coming. He had not reacted to it because reacting to it would have been evidence. He was waiting for the outcome to determine which version of his position was still viable. She watched Valor walk to Voss across the chamber floor, with blood from her shoulder on his hand where he had steadied her. Voss looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent 4 years imagining this confrontation and is now finding that reality has specific qualities that imagination never adequately accounts for. "My Lord Voss," Valor said. He stopped 6 feet away. "You've spent 4 years and considerable resources on a plan that has just ended in this room." "Plans end," Voss said. His voice was still controlled. Still the voice of a man who believes he has something left. Empires fracture. Power redistributes itself. It always has. "Yes," Valor said. "It does." He looked at Voss steadily. "But the direction of the fracture matters. And today the fracture ran through your coalition, not mine." He held the older man's gaze. "Every name on that document, every governor, every commander, every council member you cultivated, they're all in this room holding paper that puts their name in the record. And every witness in this chamber is watching." Voss was quiet. "You spent 4 years," Valor said, "building a structure designed to outlast any single action against it. You made it redundant. You made it patient. You made it elegant." He held the older man's gaze without heat, without personal fury, with the flat, complete certainty of a man stating conditions. "And you made one error." Voss waited. "You built it to replace what I am," Valor said. "You didn't build it to replace what this empire has become. What these 15 years have built in it. The governance structures, the trade agreements, the border stability, the provinces that are functioning rather than warring." He paused. "The people in this room are not loyal to me. Most of them are loyal to what works. and your plan doesn't offer them anything that works better than what exists. He turned away from Voss, which was itself the action, the deliberate turning of his back, the statement that the conversation was closed because there was nothing left in it worth hearing. He walked back across the chamber floor. The room held itself in the particular collective stillness of people who have just witnessed something they will be describing for the rest of their lives, trying to find the precise language for what they saw, which was not a battle exactly, and was not a negotiation exactly, and was not a speech exactly, but was something that combined all three and was more than any of them individually. He came back to Elira. She was still standing, still holding pressure on the shoulder, which was bleeding steadily through her formal dress in a way that was going to require actual medical attention shortly. Her face was the Everwin face, giving nothing away, because this room still had 200 witnesses in it, and the image that left this chamber today was the image the Empire would carry forward, and she was not going to give it the image of a woman who had just been stabbed going to pieces. He looked at her face. "Still standing," he said. "Still standing," she confirmed. Something in him settled, a visible thing, a shift in the set of his shoulders, as though a weight he had been holding at arm's length had been allowed to come to rest. "The chamber is secured," Casil said from behind them. He was slightly breathless, which was the first time Elira had seen him operate outside his controlled register, and she filed that as information about the gap between his preparation and the actual pace of events. 11 in custody. Voss is being detained. The dignitary is being treated for the restraint. A pause. Morton was found in the South Market District. He's asking to negotiate. Valor did not take his eyes off Elira when he answered. "Tell Morton he'll be heard," he said. "After." "After what, my lord?" "After my wife gets medical attention." Elira looked at him. The word wife in his mouth was different from the word as a formal designation. It had a specific weight to it that it had not carried in any of the official contexts. The weight of a thing that had become real rather than functional. "I need 5 minutes with the chamber," she said, "before medical." He looked at her shoulder, at her face, at the absolute steadiness of her. 5 minutes, he said. She turned to the chamber. The room was still full of witnesses, shaken, recalibrating, processing. The governors and commanders and foreign dignitaries who had come to this summit for the business of empire and found themselves inside something significantly larger than they had prepared for. They were the people who would carry the account of this day outward into the empire's provinces and beyond its borders, and the account they carried would shape what came next for years. She needed them to carry the right account. She stood in the center of the chamber floor with blood soaking through her formal dress at the shoulder and looked at 200 people with the same face she had walked into every difficult room with since she was old enough to understand that rooms required faces. "What you witnessed this morning," she said, and her voice was steady in the formal acoustics of the chamber, "was not the suppression of opposition. It was the documentation of a crime." She let that sit for a moment. Every name in that document had access to power in this empire. Every name chose to use that access to build a structure designed to fracture rather than strengthen. The difference between governance and conspiracy is not the desire for power. Both involve that. The difference is whether you build toward the empire's survival or toward your own position within its ruins. The room was absolutely still. "What continues from this morning," she said, "is the work. The governance reforms already in progress. The provincial representation structures being built. The border agreements and the trade compacts and the 10,000 administrative decisions that determine whether people eat or go hungry, whether borders hold or bleed." She held the room's collective attention. "That work is not done. It was not done before this morning, and it is not done after it. If you are here because you believe in that work, your presence in this chamber today was the right choice. If you are here because you believe the other side of this room was going to prevail, you now have information that should recalibrate your position." She looked at the chamber for one moment more. "The summit will resume after a 2-hour recess," she said. "The trade compact is on the agenda. So is the northern border renegotiation. So is every piece of business that brought you to this capital, because that business does not stop because someone tried to prevent it." She paused. "It was never going to stop." She stepped back. The 2-hour recess was not a recess for her. The palace physician who was brought to her in the small anteroom behind the summit chamber was a precise, efficient woman named Asil, who looked at the shoulder wound with the professional calm of someone who had treated court injuries before and was not going to perform alarm at this one. "Through and through," Aesel said. "The blade went clean. You need stitching and you need rest." "I need stitching," Elire said. "The rest is negotiable." Aesel looked at her. "You're going back in that chamber." "In 90 minutes. "Then hold still," Aesel said, in the voice of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting her patients to make sensible decisions. Vialor sat in the corner of the anteroom while Aesel worked. He had removed his formal coat and sat in his shirt sleeves with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his actual stillness. Not the performed kind, not the controlled kind, but the specific stillness of a person who has reached the far side of a sustained crisis and is now in the moment just after, where the body does not yet know it can stop bracing. He had been in that room for 15 years. She looked at him across the anteroom while Aesel worked, and she thought about what it had cost him. Not today specifically, but all of it. The accumulated weight of 15 years of running an empire alone. 15 years of distorted mirrors and managed distances, and the particular loneliness of a position so high that no one could reach it without wanting something from it. He met her eyes. "The chamber address," he said. "That was not in the plan." "No," she said. "It was the right call." "I thought so." Aesel finished and stepped back and said something to one of the attendants about fresh dressings and left the room with the brisk efficiency of someone with other patients. The anteroom was quiet. Outside, through the stone walls, the palace was moving through its recalibration. Cassile's people were processing the 11 detainees. Morton was being held in the South Quarter pending the negotiation he'd requested. The summit delegates were in various stages of consuming what had happened and deciding what it meant for their own positions. "Dorian will need to be briefed properly," she said. "Yes, and the provinces with the confirmed coalition governors will need interim administrators while the cases are processed." "Yes, and we need to review the entire summit security infrastructure for additional compromised positions before we resume, because Severin may not have been the only placement." "Cassile's already running that," he said. She breathed. "The Empire is going to be different after today," she said. "The coalition is broken, but the conditions that built it aren't. The centralization concerns, the provincial representation, the Senate authority questions. Those are real issues that Voss used but didn't invent." "I know," he said. "They need actual answers, not just the suppression of the people who raised them." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said again. "That's why the governance reforms are on the summit agenda." She held his gaze. "They were on the agenda before today," he said. "This is not new information to me." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." "I noticed," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite warmth, but was close enough that the distinction barely mattered. Outside the anteroom, the summit clock moved toward the end of the 2-hour recess. The chamber waited, full of witnesses who had come to the capital for the business of empire and had found something larger, who were now deciding what account of the morning to carry forward into the empire's provinces and beyond its borders. In the anteroom, the Queen of Valor sat with a freshly stitched shoulder and the cold, clear quality of a person who has come through the far side of a crisis intact and is already thinking about what comes next. The king sat across from her with his father's crown on a table to his left, which he had set there when he removed his coat, and which caught the morning light in the particular way of things made to endure. 90 minutes, she said. 90 minutes, he agreed. Outside the stone walls of the anteroom, the last of the morning light crossed the summit chamber's high windows, and in the corridors of Blackspire Palace the word was already moving. The account of the morning taking the shape it would carry forward, the story of the day the Iron Wolf stood in the center of his own empire's summit and named the thing trying to end him, and the woman beside him stood between a blade and its target and called it a minor inconvenience and went back into the room. The story was not finished. The governance work was not finished. The empire that had survived the morning was not the empire it needed to become. But the morning had been survived. And in the anteroom behind the summit chamber, the two people who had walked into it together sat in the particular quiet of people who have paid the price of something, and know, with the bone-deep certainty of the already tested, that they can pay it again. The summit resumed on time. That was the first decision, and it was the right one. And both of them understood why without discussing it. A 2-hour recess, followed by the orderly resumption of imperial business, was a statement that no speech could have made with the same precision. It said, "The morning happened, the morning is accounted for, and the work continues." It said the empire was not the men who had tried to fracture it. It was the structures they had tried to fracture, and those structures were still standing. Elira walked back into the chamber with her shoulder dressed, and her formal jacket replaced by a simpler one borrowed from one of Petra's staff, dark blue, which happened to be the right color. The stitches pulled when she moved her left arm, and she did not move it more than necessary, which was a practical adjustment rather than a concession. The room received her differently than it had received her at the morning's opening. She registered this without letting it alter anything about how she moved through it. Respect that arrives after a demonstration is a different commodity from respect that precedes it, and she had learned enough about power structures in the past 3 weeks to understand that the difference mattered. What the chamber was giving her now was conditional in the way that almost all political respect was conditional, calibrated to what she had proven rather than what she was. And the proving would have to be ongoing because that was the nature of the environment she was operating in. She sat. The summit proceeded. The trade compact negotiations ran 4 hours, contentious in the specific way that trade negotiations between parties with unequal leverage always were, full of the careful language of people trying to get more than they offered while appearing to offer more than they got. She contributed twice, both times on technical points in the Eastern provincial arrangements where she had direct knowledge from everyone's own trade situation that the imperial advisors were missing, and both times the contributions landed cleanly, without performance, without positioning, just accurate information placed in the right moment. Veilor heard both contributions without looking at her. She understood that too. The chamber was watching both of them, measuring the temperature between them for the specific information that the temperature between a king and his queen carried in the political economy of an imperial court. Showing it too readily would invite manipulation of it. She kept the professional distance and trusted that he could read the same dynamics she was reading. The northern border renegotiation was shorter and cleaner because the coalition's collapse had removed 3 of the provincial voices that had been driving the most contentious positions, and what remained was a set of legitimate territorial disputes that had actual resolution frameworks available to them if the parties were not being deliberately obstructive. They were no longer being deliberately obstructive. By the time the summit closed in the late afternoon, the major compact had been initialed. 2 border dispute frameworks had been agreed in principle, and the formal documentation of the morning's events had been entered into the imperial record by a notary who kept his face entirely professional throughout the process, and who Elira suspected would be discussing it in his household for the rest of his life. The 11 detainees were processed through the formal legal infrastructure over the following week. Elira was present for the tribunal sessions, which were held in the formal judicial chamber with the same witnesses and documentation rigor she had insisted on for the summit record. Each case was heard separately. Each piece of documentation was entered and verified. The process was slow, and it was deliberate, and Veilor held to it without deviation, even when 3 of the provincial governors sent their family advocates with arguments for expedited clemency proceedings, and even when 2 foreign courts sent formal diplomatic notes expressing their concern for the dignitary currently in imperial custody. She watched him hold the line on the process and thought about what it cost him, not personally but politically, the sustained pressure of an institution defending its own procedural integrity against the accumulated weight of people who would have preferred a faster and less formal resolution. And she thought about the difference between a king who used process as a tool when it was convenient and a king who used it as a constraint on himself as well as on others. The constraint on yourself was the harder thing. It was also the only version that meant anything. Lord Renlar received a sentence of permanent exile from the imperial territories and the stripping of his council title and land holdings. He accepted it in the tribunal chamber with the face of a man who had prepared for worse and was recalibrating toward managing what he had received. She watched him walk out of the chamber and thought about the alcove on her first night, the servant girl's wrist, the pleasantness of his voice, and then she let it go because carrying it would not serve anything useful, and she had limited capacity to carry things that did not serve something useful. Harwick's sentencing was different. He was the last of the 11 to be heard by her suggestion, because she had understood from the first that his case had a specific weight that the others did not and would require a different quality of attention in the room. He was 63 years old, and he had served the imperial court for 31 years, and he had,
By every account she had gathered, spent the first 27 of those years in genuine service.
The 4 years of the coalition were documented. The connections to Voss's network were documented. The cipher clerk placement was documented. There was no evidentiary ambiguity. What there was, sitting beneath the documentation, was the question of why, which was not a legal question, but was the kind of question that determined what sense a person could make of a thing after the formal record was complete. He told them, when asked, not the legal defense version. Something underneath it, something he delivered in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had finished performing everything he had prepared and was now simply stating what was true because he was too tired to do anything else. You were going to dismantle what we built, he said. He was looking at Valor, not at the tribunal panel, not at Elira. At Valor. The Senate reforms, the military restructuring, the provincial governance changes. Everything that the empire was organized around before you took the throne, you were systematically replacing. He paused. I spent 30 years building those structures. I believed in them, and I watched you take them apart piece by piece because they were inefficient. And you were right. They were inefficient, but they were also the framework that men like me understood how to operate inside. He stopped again. I was afraid of what came after, and Voss gave me a language for the fear that made it sound like principle. The tribunal chamber was quiet. Valor looked at Harwick for a long moment. You should have come to me, he said. His voice was not angry. It was something harder than anger, and also something more complicated, the voice of a man stating a fact that has cost something to arrive at. I know, Harwick said. 31 years. You could have come to me and told me that the pace of reform was destabilizing your ability to function. I would have heard it. I know, Harwick said again. I know that now. The sentence was exile, lighter than Renlar's in one respect, because the documentation showed Harwick's involvement had been primarily informational rather than operational. Heavier in another respect because the exile came with the formal record of 31 years of service ending in this tribunal chamber, which was a weight that no geographic sentence could adequately capture. He left without looking back. Valor sat in the tribunal chair for a long time after Harwick's advocate guided him out. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance, and Elira, sitting to his left, did not speak. She had learned his silences well enough by now to know which ones needed to be filled and which ones needed to be left their full space. This one needed its full space. There is something that happens to a person when they discover that a betrayal was not born in malice, but in fear, and it is not easier than discovering malice. In some ways it is harder. Malice is at least clean. It gives you an enemy with coherent edges. Fear wearing the mask of principle is messier because it means the person who betrayed you was also, in their own damaged way, trying to protect something they believed in, and the protection became a destruction. And somewhere in the gap between those two things, a human being made choices that could not be unmade. Understanding that does not make the choices acceptable, but it changes what you carry away from them. She watched Valor carry it. She watched him sit with the specific weight of a man who has just heard an explanation that explains without excusing, and who is now doing the long, slow work of deciding what space to give it and what space to refuse it. After a while, he said very quietly, "He taught me parliamentary procedure." She kept her voice steady. "I know. When I first took the throne, I was 23 and I had no idea how the Senate mechanics actually worked, and Harwick spent 6 months walking me through it. Patient, no judgment." He paused. "I thought that was loyalty." "It was," she said. "And then it wasn't. Both things are true." He looked at her. "Both things being true doesn't make it hurt less," he said. "No," she said. "It doesn't, but it makes it more accurate, and accurate is what you can actually build something on." She held his gaze. "Hurt is information. It tells you what mattered. What you do with what mattered is a separate question." He looked at her for a long moment with the bedrock face. The one she had come to understand was the truest version of him, the one that appeared when the operational layers had been set down. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what? Say the thing that is actually true instead of the thing that is easier." She thought about it. "Practice," she said, "and necessity. When resources are short, you stop spending them on comfortable versions of things. You start saying what is real because real is what you can use."
She paused. 3 years of declining harvest teaches you a lot about the difference between those two things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your shoulder. It's fine. It's a week old, and you've been moving through 16-hour days. So have you. I didn't take a blade in the shoulder at the summit. No, she said. You were the target. I was the one who moved. She met his eyes steadily. That's not something I require acknowledgement for. It's just what happened. He held her gaze. I know, he said, and the way he said it made clear he was not talking about acknowledgement. He was talking about something else, something that had been building since the anteroom where Aesel stitched her shoulder, and he sat in the corner in his shirt sleeves with his father's crown on the table beside him, and that had not yet found the precise language it needed. She waited. I have spent 15 years, he said slowly, as though selecting each word from a larger pool with deliberate care, building a system in which I was not required to trust anyone completely. Every alliance had a limit, every confidence had a boundary, every person who came close enough to matter was held at a calculated distance. He stopped. Because the cost of being wrong about a person when you are responsible for an empire is not a private cost. It radiates out into everything. He paused. That was not a choice born in fear. It was a choice born in understanding what the position required. Yes, she said, and it was also, he said, a choice born in fear. The tribunal chamber was empty around them. The afternoon light had moved to the western windows and was coming in at the low angle of late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like it was being seen for the first time. The two things can both be true, she said quietly. The same words she had given him about Harwick, offered back now for a different kind of truth. Yes, he said. He looked at the table for a moment. I trust you. I want you to know that clearly, not as an implication or as something that has to be inferred from my actions over the past 3 weeks, but as a statement. I trust you. It took me 15 years to say that to anyone in this empire, and I'm saying it to a woman I've known for 23 days. Elira was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I trust you too. That took you slightly less than 23 days, he observed. I was paying attention, she said. Something happened in his face. Not a smile exactly, because Vaelor Draven did not smile easily, and the version of him that appeared in informal moments was not a softened version of the formal one, but a different register entirely, quieter and more direct. But something adjacent to it. Something that had been absent from his face for long enough that its presence changed the whole quality of the room. She felt it reach her. She let it. There is a particular moment in the life of a person who has been surviving for a long time, managing and calculating and maintaining the operational distance necessary to function in conditions of ongoing difficulty when the conditions shift. When the weight becomes bearable by means other than sheer endurance, the moment arrives quietly and does not announce itself with the drama that years of bracing have prepared you for, and the absence of drama is the most disorienting thing about it, because you have spent so long in the posture of the braced person that the absence of what you were bracing against is almost harder to absorb than the thing itself. She sat in the late afternoon light of the tribunal chamber and let the moment arrive without managing it, which was something she had not done in 3 years and which required a specific, conscious relaxation of a habit so ingrained she had stopped noticing it was a habit. It felt like putting something down. She had not known how heavy it was until she set it on the floor. The governance work continued through the following weeks. It was detailed and complex and unglamorous, and it was, she found, the work she was best equipped for, the patient methodical work of taking apart something that wasn't functioning and rebuilding it on better principles. She brought Kale to the capital. He arrived on a gray morning 3 weeks after the summit, thinner than she remembered, but otherwise himself. 17 years old and sharp-jawed and carrying the particular combination of pride and anxiety of a young person who has been trusted with real responsibility and has discovered that real responsibility is heavier and more interesting than anticipated. She met him in the outer courtyard, and he looked at her for a long moment, checking her the way people who have been separated during difficult events check the people they were worried about, running the visible inventory before the words came. The shoulder, he said. Almost healed. You got stabbed. I moved in time to make it minor. It's still a stab wound, Elira. Yes, she said. It is.
She looked at her brother, her 17-year-old brother, who had spent 3 weeks managing a house's recovery and had done it, by all the reports she'd received, with a steadiness that had surprised even Aldrich. The grain distribution. Running on schedule. The Eastfield rehabilitation is slower. Torvus has ideas about the soil, but we need more specialized knowledge than he has. I'll send someone from the Imperial Agricultural Office. Already requested, he said, 3 days ago. Aldrich found the contact. She looked at him. You're all right, she said, and it came out with more feeling than she intended, which was the disadvantage of dropping the operational habit in a moment when something actually mattered. I'm all right, he confirmed. Elira. He looked at her directly. You're different. I've had a busy month. No, he said. It's not that. He studied her with the specific attention of someone who has known a person their whole life and is now recalibrating the known data against a new variable. You're not braced. She considered this. No, she said. I'm not. He looked past her toward the palace and then back at her and said, with the directness of a 17-year-old who had not yet learned to soften his observations, Is he good to you? She thought about the anteroom, the tribunal chamber, the North Tower study in the gray hours before the summit, the hand at her arm when the blade landed. Yes, she said, in his way. What does that mean? It means he's not a gentleman and he doesn't operate like a gentleman, but he is honest and he pays his debts first, and he does not require me to be smaller than I am. She met Cale's eyes. That's more than most. Cale was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said, which, from Cale, was everything. Valor met him at dinner that evening. She watched the two of them across the table with the specific attention she gave to things that mattered, her brother who was still learning what he was capable of, and the man who had spent 15 years learning what he was and was still, she thought, arriving at some of the answers. Violor spoke to Cale the way she had watched him speak to young military officers in briefing sessions, without condescension and without performance, as a person with relevant experience speaking to a person acquiring it, which was a particular quality that many powerful people never managed, and which told her something she had not needed confirmed, but was glad to have confirmed regardless. She did not say anything about it afterward. She didn't need to. Voss's tribunal was the last of the formal proceedings, and by far the most attended. The provincial governors who had not been involved in the coalition sent representatives. 3 foreign courts sent observers. The imperial press, such as it was, packed the public gallery. He arrived in the tribunal chamber with the bearing of a man who had made a decision about how he was going to occupy this moment and was not going to deviate from it. 60 years old, silver-haired, the settled authority of 4 years of patient construction behind him, and all of it gone now. And something in his face that was not regret exactly, but was the expression of a person who has looked honestly at the distance between the thing they believed they were building and the thing they actually built. He was charged with conspiracy against the crown, the murder of Lord Sene through the instrumentality of agents under his direction, the suborning of imperial officials, and the attempted assassination of the king and queen. He did not contest the charges. When asked if he wished to address the tribunal before sentencing, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Violor across the chamber and said, "You will break what you're building, too." His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man making what he considered an accurate prediction. Every king who builds something new eventually becomes the thing that is keeping the next new thing from existing, he said. I believed I was building towards something better. I was wrong about the methods. I was wrong about the cost. He paused. I was not wrong that the structures you build will eventually need to be broken by someone who comes after you. Valor looked at him steadily. I know, he said. Voss was quiet. The difference, Valor said, is that I'm building toward the structures outlasting me, not depending on me. The governance reforms, the provincial representation, the Senate restructuring, all of it is designed so that when I'm gone, the Empire doesn't require another me to hold it together. He held Voss's gaze. You wanted to replace me with yourself. I'm trying to make myself unnecessary. The tribunal chamber was very still. Something moved across Voss's face, something complicated and private and brief. Then I was wrong about more than the methods, he said. He received permanent exile and the dissolution of his provincial holdings, with the territories redistributed to locally elected governance councils under the new provincial framework that was still being constructed but whose principles had been established. He left the chamber without looking back. She stood on the high balcony of the North Tower on an evening in early winter, 3 months after the summit, watching the capital below. The markets were active despite the cold. The streets carried their ordinary traffic, the commerce and movement of a city conducting its daily business without particular awareness of what had happened in the summer, or with the awareness that had faded into background knowledge, the kind that shapes a place without being actively present in it. She heard him come out behind her. He stood beside her at the railing and looked at what she was looking at. The city, the markets, the evening lights coming on in the residential districts, the specific warm pattern of a place settling into nightfall. "Cale goes home tomorrow," she said. "I know. He spent 3 hours with the agricultural office today. He told me he has opinions about drainage. He has opinions about several things," Valor said. "He's going to be interesting." She looked at him. He was looking at the city with the particular expression she had come to know as his real one, the quiet underneath the authority, the person inside the king who had been there the whole time and who was, she thought, more fully present now than he had been 3 months ago. As though something that had been held at structural tension had been allowed to ease. "The Senate vote," she said, "passed. The provincial representation framework is formal law as of this morning." She breathed. 31 provinces, she said, each with a seat. "And none of them appointed by the crown," he said. "Elected from the provincial councils, with defined terms and defined authorities, and a formal process for challenging imperial legislation that doesn't require armed rebellion." He paused. "It will be contentious." "Everything worth doing is contentious." "Yes." She looked out at the city. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that only arrived in early winter when the air had lost the dust of the warmer months, and the world became temporarily precise, every edge sharp, every light distinct. She thought about this woman who had stood in the Great Hall of Everwyn 3 months ago with a royal decree in her hands, and 10 seconds to do whatever her face needed to do. She thought about the carriage through the rain-slick roads. She thought about the crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across white marble, and the way the palace had felt like a performance of power rather than its reality, and the slow process of discovering that both things were true simultaneously. She thought about what it had cost, not abstractly, in specifics. The shoulder, still occasionally stiff in cold weather, the 4-hour nights, the weight of the tribunal sessions, the specific quality of grief in Valor's face when Harwick's explanation landed, and the way she had watched him carry it, not over it or through it, but with it, integrating rather than suppressing. She thought about 60 families who were now 200 again, about the eastern fields being rehabilitated by imperial agricultural specialists, about Kyle and his opinions on drainage. There is a specific thing that suffering teaches, and it is not what the stories usually say it teaches. It does not teach you that pain makes you stronger, because that is a story comfortable people tell to make suffering seem purposeful in retrospect. What suffering actually teaches, when you go through it honestly rather than performing it, is the precise difference between what is essential and what is not. It strips the available inventory down to its load-bearing elements. And what you discover is that the load-bearing elements are almost always smaller and simpler and more human than the structure you were maintaining before the stripping. Not power, not the performance of control, not the careful managed distance that mistook itself for strength. Just this, the people you are responsible for, the work that needs doing, the person beside you who has seen the thing underneath the performance and is still here. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "You've been trying to ask me something for 2 weeks," she said. "Every time it gets close, you find a reason not to." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said carefully, "how to ask for something I haven't earned." She looked at him. In the evening light, he looked like the version of himself she had first seen across the firelit dinner table, the one underneath the king, the one that was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been carrying something genuinely heavy for a genuinely long time, except that now the tiredness had a different quality to it, less solitary. "You're asking the wrong question," she said. "What's the right question?" "The right question is whether you still think earning has to come before receiving." She held his gaze. 3 months ago, you told me you were paying your debt first, before the negotiation, before the commitment, before you knew whether it would be returned. Yes, that's the same principle, she said. You can't earn trust by withholding yourself until you've proven yourself worthy of receiving it. That's not earning. That's just another version of the managed distance. She kept her voice level and direct. The asking is part of the earning. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man who has chosen his words from a larger pool, with the same deliberateness he applied to everything that mattered. I don't want to do the rest of this alone. She held his gaze. You're not doing the rest of this alone, she said. He breathed. The evening settled around them. Below, the capital moved through its nightfall, the markets closing, the lamps coming up in the residential districts, the slow, warm rhythm of a city that was, by most measures, doing better than it had been doing 6 months ago. Not perfect, not finished. The governance work was ongoing and would be ongoing for years. The structures being built would be tested and revised. The mistakes that hadn't been made yet were already in process. That was the nature of anything real. I have a question, she said. Ask it. Do you regret it? He looked at her. The blood, she said. The cost of the throne. 15 years of it. He was quiet for long enough that she did not assume an answer was coming, and then it came in the slow, careful way of a thing that was being said honestly rather than assembled for effect. I regret the specific weight of specific days, he said. I regret Harwick, because understanding why something happened does not make it not have happened. I regret every person who was hurt in the wars I fought, on both sides, because the necessity of an action and the cost of it are not the same thing and should not be spoken about as though they are. He paused. I don't regret building what I built, because I've looked at what existed before it, and I know what it cost the people at the bottom of it. Not the ones at the top who found the old structures comfortable, but the ones at the bottom who were ground against them every day. He looked at the city. I regret that building something better required breaking things. I don't regret that things needed to be broken. She listened to this. And the crown, she said. The crown is a tool, he said. It's a very heavy, very expensive, very consequential tool, and there are days when it feels like it's wearing me rather than the other way around. He paused. But it is still just a tool. What it builds depends on who holds it and why they're holding it. She looked at the city below. Then hold it better, she said. Not as a criticism, as a statement of shared intention, the kind that did not require response because it was not a question. He turned to look at her. She was watching the city, the warm lights coming up in the evening, the ordinary, irreplaceable life of a place going about its business, market women covering their stalls, children being called in from cold streets, fires being lit in rooms where people were gathering for the evening meal. Together, she said. It was the word she had been building toward for 3 months without knowing it was the word, the one that sat at the center of everything she had paid for and everything she had received and everything she intended to continue doing. Not a declaration, a statement of fact about the present and an intention about the future. He reached for her right hand where it rested on the railing. She let him take it. They stood on the high balcony of the North Tower in the early winter evening, the city spreading below them in its warm and ordinary life, and the empire stretching beyond it to its 4 horizons. 31 provinces and contested borders, and a Senate in the process of being rebuilt, and 10,000 administrative challenges that would arrive on their desks beginning tomorrow morning. None of it was finished. None of it was ever going to be finished. That was the truth that the stories never adequately prepared you for. The thing that the version of power that presented itself as conquest missed entirely. The ending was not a moment. It was not a battle won or a conspiracy broken or a crown secured. Those were waypoints, significant ones that cost real things and meant real things. But the ending was the morning after, and the morning after that, and the slow, unglamorous ongoing work of building something worth the price you paid to protect it. The bells of the capital rang the evening watch, and the sound moved through the cold air with the resonance of stone that had been vibrating with the same tone for a very long time and intended to keep vibrating. Vaelor Draven, who had been called the Iron Wolf, who had killed his father to take a throne and spent 15 years holding it against everything the world could bring against it, stood in the evening cold with the hand of the woman from the dying house at the edge of his empire in his, and looked at what had been built and thought about what remained to build. Elira Everwin, who had stood in a great hall with a royal decree in 10 seconds and had chosen survival over safety, who had walked into the most dangerous room in the empire with a knife in her boot and her mother's face and a clear-eyed understanding of what the arithmetic required, looked at the same city he was looking at and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific quality of a person who is not merely surviving but has arrived, at real cost and with full knowledge of that cost, at something worth surviving for. The empire endured, not because a king had conquered it, not because a queen had defended it, but because two people, at the moment when the weight of it was greatest and the easiest thing would have been to set it down and walk away, had looked at each other and said, "Not yet, not like this. There is still work to do, and I am not doing it alone." That was the thing the stories called love, when they were being precise about it. Not the version that arrived easily and required nothing. The version that was built in 3-hour nights and tribunal chambers and the cold anteroom where a physician stitched a wound while a king sat in the corner of the room because he could not make himself be somewhere else. The version that was, in the end, the only version that held. Below them, the city breathed. Above them, the stars came out one by one in the winter sky, cold and clear and indifferent, the way the sky had always been. The way it would be long after every empire and every crown and every careful human construction had dissolved back into the earth that produced them. And in the space between the permanent sky and the temporary human world below it, on a high balcony in the early winter dark, two people who had paid for something real stood together in the particular quiet of people who know what they have and are not taking it for granted. Not now, not tonight, not while there was still work to do and morning to come, and a city below them full of ordinary, irreplaceable life that was, in the end, the only reason any of it had ever mattered.